Soundings presents an unabridged recording of Women of Waterloo Bridge, written by Jan Casey, read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings. Chapter 1. December, 1940. Evelyn. Evelyn sat on a thin blanket, chin on her knees, unable to take her eyes off the stairs leading down from the street. Hordes were pushing in, even though they were packed down here already. There was never a lot of room, but tonight they kept moving along under the wood-green sign and rearranging themselves to make way for others who, like them, didn't want to take their chances up there. "Budge up," Dad said, nudging Evelyn's shoulder. "We're over here now." Evelyn looked around, and her neck caught, stiff from holding it at an angle for so long. Dad cocked his thumb to a spot behind him, and Evelyn could see now that her family had moved on, and another set up camp around her. Blinking, she gathered her things and apologised to a woman who was passing bread and dripping to her children, their grubby hands still white and shivery from the cold. Settling her bedding next to his, Dad indicated the woman organising her children's tea. "That'll be you in no time," he said. Evelyn pulled a face. "Mine won't be that mucky." "Oh, won't they?" Dad smiled, as if he knew something Evelyn didn't. "You were. So was that sister of yours. Your mother used to despair." "We haven't even set a date yet," Evelyn said. Dad twisted the ring round Evelyn's finger until the minuscule gem was facing the right way. He tapped it and said, "Won't be long, though, and then—" They both looked over at the children again, in time to see the oldest girl cram the last of her tea in her mouth. Dad chuckled and picked up his paper. "Let's have a cup of tea, shall we?" "In a minute," Evelyn answered. She turned back to the entrance, searching again for her sister's burgundy heels amongst the endless pairs of shoes that descended. "Give her a chance. She'll barely have finished her shift. Then she might be meeting someone." Dad made a show of turning the page with studied nonchalance. "You know what she's like." Evelyn was as worried about Sylvie's safety as her dad, but not in the way he presumed. She wanted her here in one piece so she could kill the silly mare herself. "We all know what Sylvie's like. Nothing puts her off." Not even a night like this, Evelyn thought. If conditions were bad when she'd made her way down a couple of hours ago, things must be dreadful out there now. She knew that by the looks on the faces pressing in around her, the snippets of news she caught passed on from the newcomers. When Uncle Bert made his way towards them, hair ruffled, cap in hand, Evelyn saw him catch Dad's eye and shake his head. He didn't need to elaborate for them to understand the seriousness of what was happening above them. Evelyn gathered their cups together and negotiated her way over to the makeshift kitchen. The queue for tea was long and orderly, none of them having the energy to do anything other than shuffle their way closer to the urn. Evelyn turned several times and glanced over the heads of the women behind her to scan the platform for Sylvie. Then the line snaked around the wall and her view was obscured. She gazed down at her brown lace-ups and thought about the words she'd had with Sylvie that morning, needles of heat prickling through her as she recalled the argument. Her weekly letter from Ron had been delivered and she'd managed to grab a couple of minutes to herself after breakfast to sit and read it. She was about to slit the envelope when a movement at the front gate had cast a shadow over the sitting room. She'd moved closer to the window and craned her neck to see what had distracted her. "Sylvie!" she'd fumed when she'd glimpsed the flash of her sister's camel coat swinging out of sight. Stuffing the letter behind a cushion, she'd rammed her feet into her shoes and run out onto the pavement. She was determined that Sylvie wouldn't get away with it this time. The wiggle her sister had recently cultivated made it easy to gain on her, and when Evelyn could almost touch her, Sylvia turned, a puzzled look on her face. "Where is it?" demanded Evelyn. "What?" Sylvie said, with exaggerated innocence. It can't be in there. Evelyn snatched at the minute black clutch bag, exquisitely embroidered with tiny sequins and perfect for a night on the town after work, which Sylvie carried under her arm. Sylvie dangled the shiny bag from its strap and said, "Of course it's not. Don't be daft. Besides, that old gas mask doesn't match what I'm wearing, does it?" She swept her arms wide, encouraging Evelyn to take in her outfit from hat to shoes, and she smiled, her Max Factor red lips framing her even white teeth. She looked lovely, as she always did. Evelyn knew she could look like that, if and when she wanted to. But she wasn't going anywhere, so there was no need. Except back to the all-pervasive housework and her letter, after she'd knocked some sense into Sylvie. "Stop behaving like this. You're being irresponsible." Sylvie let her arms drop to her sides and exhaled through puffed cheeks like a deflated party balloon. "There's nothing wrong with having a bit of fun, is there? Or have you forgotten all about that? All you ever talk about is fun, and it's getting boring. I'm talking about something much more important." "Me? Boring?" Sylvie put her hands on her hips. "The word was invented for you, and that fiancé of yours. Don't start all that again, Sylvie. I'm asking you. No, I'm telling you. Come back to the house and get your mask. Then you can go and have fun." "No." Sylvie shook her head. "And don't forget, I am older and therefore wiser." "Then try acting it." "Oh, I am. It's you who's got it wrong. 22 going on 50 if you ask me. Besides, Mum told me to look out for you, not the other way around." "Don't bring Mum into it," Evelyn said, her voice catching. "She's not here, but Dad is, and he'd be gutted if he found out about this." "Well, I'm not going to tell him. Are you?" Evelyn knew when she was defeated. They stood looking at each other until Sylvie walked a few steps backwards, blowing Evelyn a kiss. "I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to Ron. He's nice enough, but a bit dry, like toast without the butter and jam. When you want it, the offer of fun's still there." Then she turned, and Evelyn watched her run towards the bus stop, her skirt revealing the perfect amount of leg with each stride. The line reached the sink. Evelyn swirled the cups around in an inch of brown water and dried them on a soggy tea towel. 3 women, about the same age as Mum would have been, hadn't stopped gossiping since they joined the queue, and were now throwing out remarks to others closer to the tea. She wondered if they recognised her, and if they did, whether they would still feel sorry for her like they had after Mum died, when they would stop to stroke her hair or search their pockets for a toffee, one for her and one for Sylvie. "Squeeze one more out, dear sister." Sylvie spoke right into Evelyn's ear, almost causing her to scald herself. "Steady!" Sylvie laughed and took the pot from Evelyn. "You see to the milk and sugar. I've got this." Relief overwhelmed Evelyn, but she checked it with a stern glare. "Your mask is in my satchel," she said. "Dig it out when Dad's not looking, and he'll think you had it with you all along." Sylvie set the pot on the small ring-stained table to brew, and put her arms around Evelyn, kissing her cheek with a loud smacking noise. "Thank you," she said. "I'll do the same for you sometime." Evelyn looked away and busied herself with the cups. "Let's take these back to Dad and Uncle Bert," she said. "No, let's be friends first," Sylvie said, rubbing at the red stain her mouth had left on Evelyn's face. "Please, I have so much to tell you, and I want to hear about your letter from Ron." Evelyn was reluctant to be drawn in so quickly. A sense of restlessness could be felt from the women in the queue behind. "Hurry up with the pot," Evelyn said, holding the cups out for Sylvie to pour. "Say it," Sylvie said, her grinning face pressed close to Evelyn's. "Say friends." "All right," Evelyn conceded, laughing out loud. "All right. Friends." The talk in their camp was all about the war. Evelyn expected that was the case everywhere. Sylvie, though, wanted to tell her about dancing, or as it had turned out that night, the lack of it. She and a girl from work had tried 2 or 3 of their usual haunts, then walked to Regent Street, where they'd heard that nothing stopped the prancing at the Paradise. Evelyn opened her mouth to chastise Sylvie for roaming so far, but stopped herself because she didn't want to start another quarrel. More to the point, she was enjoying Sylvie's retelling of her evening. She could picture the clubs and pubs they'd called in on, and how she and her friend had escaped to the lav to repaint their faces and laugh at a couple of blokes they'd met along the way. "So you managed to fight them off?" Evelyn asked. Sylvie rolled her eyes. "It didn't take much. They were all over the place, the soppy sods. The Paradise was a dead loss too, packing up like everywhere else. Well, everyone needed to get to a shelter or home if they could." "I know," Sylvie sighed and smoothed her stockings over her calves. "Don't matter. Tomorrow's another day." "And the day after that? New Year's Eve?" "Got to be something happening then. Dancing and a bit of fun," Evelyn finished for her. "And you're coming out with me that night, with me and Helen. No arguing with your big sister." Quiet supplanted the earlier commotion. A few kids who'd been chasing around with battered paper crowns on their heads, holding tight to Christmas for as long as possible, stopped their games and settled down. Some men nearby played a muted hand of cards, and from close to the tunnel, underneath faded red and green garlands, working their way loose from slimy walls, a group of women started to sing a song. No one joined in, perhaps because what was happening up there made it impossible to muster the energy. A number of people were still coming down, but, sure that no trains would pass through until dawn, wardens were guiding them onto the tracks, something Evelyn hadn't seen happen before. "This is horrible," Sylvie said, looking around. "Would you choose to sleep with any of these people?" "Trust you to think of that." "No, I mean just sleep. If any one of them suggested such a thing in normal circumstances, you'd be appalled, wouldn't you? I would." Evelyn nodded and flared her nostrils, a vile smell hitting the back of her throat. She waved her hand in front of her face and said, "The stench! It's okay when I don't think about it." "But when you do," Sylvie gagged. "Here." She tapped a few drops of 4711 onto one of Dad's big hankies, and they sat side by side with it pressed to their faces. Sylvie unclasped her ear clips and nestled them in the toes of her shoes. They punched their coats into pillow shapes and lay down close together. "Now," Sylvie said, her hands under her head, "tell me about Ron. Anything exciting to report from Colchester?" Evelyn was hoping Sylvie had forgotten about the letter from Ron. She felt the same wound reopening as it had done earlier when Sylvie had said Ron was dull. And the times before when she'd called him boring and dreary and tedious. She was left in no doubt about what Sylvie thought of Ron. "Well," Sylvie propped herself up on her elbow, "what did Loverboy have to say for himself?" "Well, the truth is," Evelyn picked a bit of fluff off her blanket and rolled it into a ball. "I was so upset after our set to that I didn't read Ron's letter after all." "Oh," Sylvie slumped down. "Sorry, I really am." "Never mind," Evelyn said, although that wasn't the truth. Sylvie would be unshakable if she knew what Evelyn had felt when she'd opened the envelope and unfolded the sheets of writing. The letter was dated Monday, the 23rd of December, 1940. Ron always wrote on a Monday. "My dearest fiancée Evelyn," it started. Evelyn had searched through all the other letters from Ron she kept in Mum's old writing box, and she was right. The greeting was the same on every single one. Then he went on to tell her what he'd had for tea in the canteen that evening, and hoped he wasn't making her tummy rumble with hunger. She could probably write a book about the meals served in training camps. She hadn't needed to read the rest of the letter to know that there would be a bit about the weather, something that witty Chalky White had said to make the lads laugh, details of pressing his uniform, and how his ingrown toenail was healing, or not. Huge tears had boiled over the rims of her eyes then and scorched her cheeks as they ran down her face. She'd balled up the letter and thrown it in with the others, kicking the box back under her bed. "Perhaps," Sylvie's voice was teasing now, "perhaps your Ron's a dark horse, and the letter is just too saucy to share. Was it? Sylvie leaned closer. Go on, tell all. Oh, Evelyn groaned and turned away from Sylvie. She'd given herself a firm telling off as the day had worn on, reminding herself what a decent, steady chap Ron was. And that was why she was going to marry him. All she needed to do was concentrate on Ron's good points, and there were plenty of them. She wouldn't be drawn into Sylvie's cataloguing of the qualities he lacked. But Sylvie never could stand silence for long. Do you think people have a quick dash up the channel under the blankets? Sylvie said. Evelyn laughed out loud. I don't like to think about it, but I expect they do, she said. You can hear them sometimes, trying hard to be clever and quiet. They were still for a minute, then both realised at the same time they'd been listening for the sounds of stifled moans and grunts. Dad wound his way towards them and bent to kiss them both on their foreheads. They watched him crawl under his bedding and cover his face with yesterday's paper. Good job he didn't hear us, Sylvie said. He would have been shocked and said something about Mum wanting us to be nice girls. They tried to muffle their laughter, stuffing their knuckles into their mouths. Are you, Sylvie? Nice. Sylvie folded her hands and lowered her eyes as if she was in church. I'm trying. I say to my admirers, dancing's one thing, but there'll be none of the other. You're more likely, though, so close to being Mrs. Ron. Sylvie opened her eyes and looked eagerly at Evelyn. Is it hard to keep saying no? Evelyn lay back and looked up at the sloping tiled roof. She wished it was. When Ron had walked her home after their engagement party last June, he'd pushed his hand up her skirt and found the top of her thigh. There, he drew feeble circles round and round with shaking fingers until her flesh felt numb. He kissed her neck and the top of her breasts, but never dared push her vest aside to expose them to his mouth. And no matter how she moved against him, that was it. It became a pattern, that and his tongue limp against hers, and every time they were alone together it was the same, until she cringed when he started his fiddling. Well, Sylvie said, we were just getting to the good bit. You wear me out. Evelyn turned on her side and pulled her engagement ring over her knuckle, then shoved it back down on her finger with force. She closed her eyes, longing for sleep. Standing at the sink, Evelyn lifted up the grey dishcloth and studied the holes in the threadbare material. She watched as a stream of greasy water dripped into the washing-up bowl, leaving bits of carrot and potato clinging to the loose fibres. She wrung it out and sighed. The last thing she felt like was a night on the town, but upstairs in their bedroom, Sylvie was organising clothes and makeup like a military operation, telling her they would get ready together when everything was set out. She shook the rag and dropped it into a bowl of bleach. Perhaps she'd feel better in a couple of hours when she was fresh and clean, rejuvenated like the cloth when she fished it out. After gathering the coal scuttles together, she carried them towards the shed. The fireplaces still needed to be set for the morning, the dishes were waiting to be dried, and there were Dad's sandwiches to cut and wrap ready for his night in the underground. A currant loaf in the oven would soon be ready, and she always made sure the blackouts were secure. It hadn't been like this before her engagement. Both she and Sylvie had worked then, so they shared the chores, and to be fair, it had been she who changed the routine. She'd been in her first year of teaching and loved it, but Ron said there was no point in her carrying on. You might as well leave now, he'd said, as wait until after we're married, and then feel as though you're being forced out. There was some sense in his logic, but his certainty about how she would feel had niggled at her. When she tried to explain to him that she was more than capable of putting across her own point of view, he wouldn't have any of it. Don't be so silly, he'd said, dismissing the subject with a wave of his hand. It was a misunderstanding, that's all. Once at home all day, there was no reason for her not to take over the running of the household, as she had to do something with her time. In training to be Mrs. Ron, Sylvie said, in a chirping tone of voice that made it sound as though Evelyn should be grateful for finding her calling. But it didn't feel as though being a wife and taking care of the domestic side of life would be enough for her. Or was she allowing herself to think in a selfish and indulgent manner when dissatisfaction nudged its way in around the endless tasks of polishing, wiping down, scrubbing and dusting? From what little she could remember of Mum, She had never seemed disgruntled or displeased about the endless cycle of shopping, cooking and cleaning, nor did other women she had a chance to observe going about their daily business. Perhaps having children to care about made for a difference in perspective. Or maybe most women accepted their lot and got on with it, and she would have to learn to do the same. But that made her heart sink down towards her practical and inelegant house slippers. She thought about Rosie Harris, with her crooked teeth and the coat that was 2 sizes too small, and her endless questions. "Why do lady teachers have to leave when they get married?" she'd asked, and Evelyn hadn't been able to give her an answer that satisfied either of them. Rosie had cried when the school said goodbye during morning prayers, and so had Evelyn when she left for the last time. Sometimes she saw 1 or 2 of the children who hadn't gone to the country, and they always shouted after her, "Are you coming back to school, Miss Draper?" She would flash her ring and say, "You know I can't, I'm getting married." Then she would smile so they could see how happy she was. She felt for her ring now, but her finger stroked an empty space. For a moment, she was unsettled until she remembered she'd put it on the shelf, safe from the washing up and the coal. She studied her hand without it, tracing the indentation where the ring usually settled, and rubbing the small callus that had appeared where the band pressed down into the flesh of her palm. In 20 years' time, she thought, the imprint of the ring on her finger would be indelible, as if she had been branded. She must remember to put it on before she went out later. It was time to get a move on. Sylvie would soon be ready to transform her. Everything Sylvie owned was spread around the bedroom. Dresses and jackets laid out on the bed, necklaces hanging over them to maximise their effect, makeup and scent bottles in rows on the dresser, shoes against the wall, a bowl of sugar water on the bedside table. Sylvie was busy inspecting items of clothing for marks or loose threads. "Now," Sylvie was businesslike, "you've seen all of these before." She pointed to the bed. "So has everyone in London. But we can make anything look a bit different if we mix and match. See anything you fancy?" Evelyn looked through the outfits, touching the material and holding 1 or 2 up against herself for Sylvie's reaction. Anything she borrowed would have to be adjusted in some way, a pin at the neckline or a fold at the waist. "I think I'll wear my turquoise dress." "Your engagement dress?" Sylvie looked up, a bottle of scarlet nail varnish suspended mid-shake. "I thought you were keeping that wrapped in tissue paper." "Well, that seems a shame, doesn't it?" "I always thought so." "Just to wear it the once." Evelyn remembered how it accentuated her neck and cleavage, and made her legs seem longer. "And it fits so well." "You look lovely," Sylvie said. "Now, let's get our hair set." Evelyn sat down in a chair facing the mottled mirror that showed their faces back to them as distorted pieces of mosaic. Sylvie tipped it so they could both see what she was doing. Evelyn watched her pick up swathes of her thick, fair hair and twist it around strips of fabric, tie the ends of the rags together, and leave the waves to set. They swapped places, and Evelyn pushed Sylvie's darker hair into finger curls with the syrupy water. They finished dressing, let their hair down, turned around as far as they could to scrutinise themselves in the mirror. Pleased with their reflections, they turned off the lights and gas and stepped out into the cold night. Helen was waiting for them outside Piccadilly Tube. They linked arms, Evelyn in the middle, so she could be guided along by Sylvie and Helen, who seemed to know the route like automatons. As they walked along Shaftesbury Avenue, they chatted over Evelyn about work. Sylvie had recently left her job with Lyons and signed up as a labourer on a building site. "Are you doing that too?" Evelyn asked Helen. "Am I?" said Helen. "It's either that or the telephone exchange, next to St Paul's." "You could get another job now, Evelyn," Sylvie said. "Not this again." "But Ron couldn't object to war work, or shouldn't anyway." They hurried down Greek Street and cut across Soho Square. Then they turned right and went down a few steps. A narrow doorway led to a dark corridor that smelled of carpet stained with spirits and Craven A. They checked their coats in at the cloakroom, and Evelyn followed Sylvie and Helen towards the contagious noise of laughter and chatter on the opposite side of the swing doors. The band must have been on a break, as the light hit her first. Nowhere had been this bright for more than a year, and she shaded her face with her hand while she adapted. Helen was saying something to her, and she had to lean close to hear. "Your ring! Sylvie told me you're engaged. I was going to ask to see your ring." Helen looked at Sylvie, worried she might have said the wrong thing. Sylvie grabbed at Evelyn's hand. "Why, you little minx," she said. "I left it on the side, near the sink. And there I was, thinking I'd have to force you to have a good time when you had this planned all along. It was a genuine mistake." Evelyn could feel her face glowing. She was desperate to make them believe her. "Perhaps I should go back." "Don't be so daft," Sylvie said. "You're out, and you'll stay out and enjoy yourself." Evelyn saw her look over at Helen and raise her eyebrow. "Much more without that ring on? Look, I think there's room over there." Sylvie nodded her head towards everyone she recognised around the table, and Evelyn repeated their names. A man with oily hair said he'd get them a drink. Evelyn sat down next to a woman wearing the most authentic-looking string of costume pearls she'd ever seen, with a bracelet to match, her long, elegant fingers playing languidly with the gin and it on the table in front of her. The lights dimmed. The band took their places, and Sylvie and Helen were soon in the thick of it. Evelyn caught sight of them as they swept past, and then lost them amongst the turning crowd. Reaching for the drink she thought must be hers, she sat and tapped her foot in time to the music. The table was quiet now, only one couple sitting close together, and a young man with a disappointed look on his face, drawing circles in a patch of sticky residue. Evelyn felt a touch on her shoulder and looked up to see a man in an immaculate navy uniform, leaning towards her. "Can you foxtrot?" he inquired anxiously. A deep crease running along his forehead as if he'd been scored with a paring knife. Evelyn wondered if he was working his way around the club, hoping each time he asked a girl to dance that the answer wouldn't be another rejection. He didn't look as though he would lurch at her or try to pin her too close. He was tame, she decided, but when she stood, she was surprised at how tall he was, and when he led her to the floor, his hand on her elbow was firm. "I took lessons at home," he said, after a few minutes spent watching his feet and counting time under his breath. "How am I doing?" He looked up and grinned, the groove across his brow disappearing. "They've paid off," she said. He was more relaxed now, although his hands were a bit damp, and he kept looking down to study his footwork. Evelyn noticed his neat ears, and liked the smell of what he used to tame his thick wavy hair. "Where's home?" she said. "Scotland?" "Belfast. I'm an engineer at Chatham. You know, in Kent. What do you do?" Evelyn looked at her hand, resting on this strange man's lapel. The depression left by her engagement ring had lifted, that finger now as plump and filled out as the others. "I'm a teacher." "Oh, really? How'd you stand it? I feel sorry for you if your class is anything like mine was. Joe's the name, by the way." "Evelyn." The band shifted to a quick step. They readjusted their hands. Joe counted a few bars, and they glided around the floor with everyone else. She felt a nudge, and when she turned, Sylvie winked at her. "My sister," she explained. "This was her idea. She thinks I need to go out more often." "Too busy marking copybooks. That's no good." "No," Evelyn said. "I don't suppose it is." The dance ended, and Joe walked her back to the table. "Would you like a drink?" he asked. "I've got one here somewhere, thanks." He produced a pack of cigarettes, lit hers and one for himself. He handed her the drink she'd pointed to, and then they stood against a pillar, watching the dancers and commenting on their techniques. "Wasn't that your sister?" Joe asked. "Probably," said Evelyn. "She's with another different lad." "Then there's no probably about it," Evelyn laughed. "That was Sylvie." "Shall we? Again?" But before he could put her glass on the table, the band leader turned to the floor and said, "Ladies' request." Evelyn hesitated. That felt less innocent somehow, asking Joe to dance with her instead of the other way around. A flush spread up from his collar as he waited, and Evelyn remembered his anxiety from earlier. "Where's the harm in it?" she thought, and was about to take his hand when a pretty girl in a lavender blouse spun him around and pulled at his sleeve. Looking over his shoulder at Evelyn, he was led away through the tables and into the middle of a waltz. Then she lost sight of him. 2 other nice, polite men asked Evelyn to dance. She hoped she'd see Joe again, at least to mouth sorry to him. But the crowd thickened and became more raucous, and she eventually gave up. Around 11, there was some talk of moving on to the Astoria to see in the new year. "What shall we do?" Helen asked. "Go on or stick to what we know?" "Let's try Hatchett's," Sylvie said. "Evelyn wants to see more than one place on her only night out this year." "Evelyn?" "Yes, let's," Evelyn said. "That way we won't have far to go to the tube after midnight." The streets were busy. So many people determined to suspend everyday reality for a few hours of revelry, hoping that to say the words Happy New Year would make it come true. They were waiting to cross at the bottom of the road when Evelyn heard someone shout her name. All 3 of them turned and saw Joe dodging his way towards them. "I must have forgotten something," Evelyn said, searching herself to see what it might be. "I'm glad I caught you." Joe was out of breath. "You're a fine dancer. I didn't trip up once with you." Evelyn laughed and said, "That's not what my feet are telling me." For a moment, Joe looked hurt, the rut reappearing along his forehead. Then he laughed too. "Here's how you can get in touch with me, if you'd like to." He pressed the torn corner of a beer mat into her hand, an address scrawled on it in pencil. Sylvie and Helen were watching for her response, amused looks on their faces. "Joe!" they heard a shout from a crowd of men. "We're going this way!" Evelyn tried to pass the scrap of paper back to Joe, but he closed her fingers around it. Then he pressed his mouth to hers with a solid hand on the back of her head. She was startled and made a small noise of protest, but his lips were cool, and his tongue, when it found hers, was hot and full of energy. "Joe!" Another shout from further away, and he ran towards his friends without looking back. After a few seconds of silence, during which Sylvie and Helen looked stunned, they both began whooping and cheering with delight. "Stop it," said Evelyn, wiping her mouth on the back of her hand. She felt mortified at what she'd allowed to happen. "It's all right," Sylvie said. "You've probably had too much to drink." Let them think that. Then they might not keep on at her. They carried on to Hatchett's, but Evelyn couldn't think about anything else except that kiss and how it had made her feel. A tide of disloyalty washed over her in waves. But she hadn't thought about Ron then, not while it was happening. Now each time she replayed the scene, her remorse became more raw. She refused to dance and wouldn't have a drink. Someone pulled her from her seat for Auld Lang Syne, but as soon as it was over, she told Sylvie and Helen she was going home. Well, down to Wood Green Tube. Dad was expecting them. "Sorry to put a damper on the evening," she said, "but I've had enough for one night." Helen stayed on with some other girls she knew, and Sylvie decided to leave with Evelyn. They walked to the tube in silence, but on the way down, Sylvie said, "Don't worry about this. Ron will never know." Evelyn turned to her sister sharply. "No, he won't. No one will. And don't goad me to go out with you again. I know you mean well, but just don't." "I won't," said Sylvie. And she kept her promise. By the middle of March, Evelyn was pleased to realise that when she thought about Joe, she couldn't quite picture his face. The kiss, however, was taking a bit longer to blot out. Working her way through a pile of potatoes, peeler in hand, she heard the post land on the doormat. Late again. But these days it was a wonder it arrived at all. She dried her hands and was surprised to see a letter from Ron. It was Monday. How could he write a letter and it be delivered on the same day? She tore it open. One sheet of paper. There'd always been 2. "Dear Evelyn," it began. Not the usual reference to her being his fiancée. She felt as if she'd been demoted. "You're a lovely girl," the letter went on. "That is why I cannot continue to string you along. The fact is, I have met someone else. Please do not think badly of me, and I swear to you that nothing has happened, in that way, between us yet. But I am afraid that I do like this girl, and it has made me think that you and I are not really very well suited. I find your independent attitude a bit overpowering, And I also get the feeling that you want more fun out of life than I can give you. That makes me feel on edge. I know you will find someone who deserves you and who will love and take care of you. I hope in time you can think fondly of me as I do of you. Ron. Evelyn was stunned. How dare he? Boring Ron Clark had jilted her, or as good as, met someone else, and nothing had happened yet. She was outraged. Well, it won't, she thought. Jane or Daisy or Anne or whatever your name is. Nothing except a cold lump of tongue pushed like a dead slug against yours. Well, you're welcome to that. She marched back to the kitchen and attacked the vegetables, scraping and chopping and tunnelling eyes out with a vengeance. Then she changed the beds and put the sheets in the copper to boil. She polished the mantelpiece, washed the kitchen floor, blacked the front doorstep. At 5:30 she put the kettle on the gas, ready for Sylvie's arrival home, and wondered why she hadn't cried. She stood still for a minute, watching the flames lick and twist around the pot. "Thank you, Ron," she whispered. She looked at the letter again and kissed it. "Thank you very much." When Evelyn heard the gate click, she flopped into a chair, pulled off her ring and placed it on top of the letter. Then she curled up and covered her face with her hands. "Whatever's the matter?" Sylvie said when she walked in. Evelyn sniffed and pointed to the letter that Sylvie at once snatched up and read aloud. "This is rich." Sylvie read it again. "Ron giving you the elbow." She flung the letter aside and put her arms around Evelyn. "Oh, you poor thing. You poor little lamb. What will you do now?" In a feeble, quavering voice, Evelyn said, "I have a couple of ideas, but I'm going to need your help." "Anything," Sylvie said. "And I hope one of them is wringing his scrawny neck." Unable to keep up the pretence, Evelyn spread her hands, like shutters opening on a spring day, and laughed aloud. "Visit the Labour Exchange in the morning," she said. "And how do you fancy a dance tonight?" The waiting room was stuffy and crowded. Evelyn's feet throbbed to the rhythm of one of last night's dance numbers. Her eyes felt dry, and she had to keep blinking to keep them open. She was sure she'd had, at most, 2 or 3 hours' sleep. Sylvie, sitting next to her on a hard wooden bench, looked for all the world as if she'd gone to bed at 9 with a boring book and a mug of Horlicks. "What time did we get home?" she asked Sylvie. Sylvie looked up from examining her nails. "About 3? 1:45, I think." The wall clock read 10:30. "That's terrible," Evelyn said. "I know," Sylvie beamed with delight. "But we had a great time, didn't we?" Evelyn managed to smile. "Yes, I think so," she said. "But I don't think I could make a habit of it." The signage above one row of windows at the counter read, "Men," the other, "Women." But the women in the Labour Exchange this morning far outnumbered the men. This is what it's going to be like, Evelyn thought. Most of the men away and women holding the fort. For a fleeting moment, dread passed through her, like the aftershock of a bomb exploding somewhere close by. War was a ghastly way of making it possible for women to do something else besides the drudgery of housework, no matter how exciting that prospect seemed. Posters on the walls depicted some of the things that women could sign up to do. They could replace postmen, farmers, bus conductors, ambulance drivers. There were women in smart suits carrying briefcases and walking towards offices, women in white coats doling out ladles full of soup, women holding spanners, blowing whistles through a fog of steam on a train platform, measuring milk into churns. They were all smiling and looked the picture of health. "Someone told me that soon girls will be told where to work, a bit like conscripted men. But I think you can ask for what you want to do for now," Sylvie said. "Given it any thought?" "It would be a shame not to use what I learned when I was teaching. Do you suppose there's any need for someone to instruct the armed forces in reading and writing?" "I suppose it's possible," Sylvie said. "Although it might be interesting to try something completely different. Something I wouldn't have a chance to do otherwise. Is that why you went for building work?" "No," Sylvie shook her head. "I thought I should do something that was considered war work rather than serving food in a restaurant. So I let them place me where the labour was most needed." "Miss Evelyn Draper," Window 6, please. When Evelyn stood, the floor beneath her seemed to wobble. She made her way to the counter by pulling herself along unsteadily from one chair to another. When she sat down, she could feel the heat rising off the women at the windows next to her. From behind, she was certain she could feel the breath of others who were pressing forward. The interviewer was an older woman with a topknot and powder caked around her nose. She filled in a form on Evelyn's behalf with a pencil she licked between each of her questions. The counter heaved one way, then the other. Tiny coloured stars sparked in front of her eyes. Sweat pooled behind her knees. "Any preference for your war work, Miss Draper?" the woman asked. All Evelyn could think about was being outside in the fresh air. "The bridge," she managed at last. She pointed towards Sylvie for help. "My sister," she said. Sylvie caught Evelyn under her arms and propped her up. "I'm sorry," she said to the woman behind the counter. "My sister isn't feeling herself today." "Oh dear. Yes, I can see that. We've almost finished here. She said she would like to work on a bridge. Then she mentioned her sister." "Oh," Sylvie said. "That's me." Evelyn could tell by her tone of voice that Sylvie felt proud. "She wants to work with me. Construction work on Waterloo Bridge." Chapter 2. December 1940. Gwen. The world was ending. Every night Gwen thought the same thing. But tonight she was certain. The first blast hit seconds after the siren began to wail, and she was caught running with the kids to the shelter. The explosion that followed was so terrific it lit up the sky with an orange flash that stretched across the horizon and seeped into every crack in the skyline. For a second she stood mesmerised, watching the colour spread like a vile spillage on a masterpiece. "Ma'am!" Johnny shouted. "In you go," she ordered, pushing him and Will through the door. Setting Ruth down, she pressed her towards her brothers in the dark. When she turned to pull the door closed, there was a barrage to the left, or was it the right, or left again? Fires blazed here, there, the flames licking out towards each other and flaring upwards when they met. Rubble fell, and through it all she heard the rise and fall of muffled voices. She forced herself to bang the door shut, knowing that the muted, distorted noises would be harder to bear than being in the middle of the chaos outside. She rested her head on her arms and willed it to stop. Just stop, or let the whole world end now. Instead, the world shuddered and heaved sickeningly with what she was sure must be a direct hit to the house. Had she remembered to turn off the gas? She saw herself closing the tap after tea, or was that the night before? Another series of strikes ricocheted around the shelter, each more powerful than the last. She bit down hard on a healing whitlow to stifle the sobs that racked her chest. Her fingers fumbled backwards and forwards along the shelf above the door for the torch. It wasn't there, where she always kept it. Pushing her spectacles closer to her eyes, she peered into the gloom. It must be indoors. She thought it needed a new battery, and she'd meant to check. But there was a candle. Grasping it, she took a deep breath and steadied herself, desperate for the kids not to pick up on the state she was in. "It's a candle for us tonight." She tried to sound jolly, to make it seem like a treat. "Ain't we got the torch?" Johnny asked. "What's happened to it?" "It's in the kitchen. Now stay right where you are. Don't move. Johnny, keep hold of Ruthie, but let go of Will's hand." In the darkness, she sensed Will reaching out towards the candle, then felt his hands around it. "Good work." Gwen groped again and found the matches, picking them up with care. She didn't trust her nerves to hold out if she had to look for the spare box in the trunk with the other supplies against the back wall. What a ridiculous place to keep them, she thought. How could she find them there without slipping and knocking herself out on the way? "Have you got them, Mum?" Ruth whispered. "Got them." "Good work," said Johnny, lowering his voice and mimicking his mother's turn of phrase. Gwen and all three children giggled. The tension broken for a moment. "Let's get some light. Ready, Will?" "Ready, Sergeant Major," Will said, eager to match Johnny's witty success. At the instant Gwen scratched the match along the striking edge, illuminating the three waiting faces as if caught in a harsh spotlight. Another volley of fire hit from every direction. It felt as if the shelter would be rent apart. As fragile against the force as the wooden matchbox, covering her ears with her hands, Gwen let loose a guttural sound she didn't recognise. The match fell from her fingers and fizzed in the rainwater, sloshing around their feet, the darkness swallowing them up again. Ruth started to cry, and Will joined in. One brutal round followed another, each more powerful than the last. Gwen reached out towards the children, but lost her footing, landing with one leg beneath her and grazing her knee. The kids piled around, and their trembling calmed her. Keeping them safe was her priority. George was scornful when she said that, quick to remind her that everyone felt the same, but most people had more sense than to allow their kids to go through this every night. Her arms around the children, she twisted a loose shard of cuticle she'd missed earlier and tore it off her fingernail. There couldn't be any more scenes like this, she told herself firmly. No more blundering about and scaring the kids. What would George say when he came in if he found them all wet and shivering on the floor, no candle flickering and no blankets on the bunks? She knew what he would say. He'd drag up the same old argument about packing them off to the country, and finding them in this turmoil would only add fuel to his fire. "Have you still got that candle, Will?" "I've got it now, Mum," Johnny said. Gwen ruffled his fine floppy hair, and Johnny squeezed his arms tighter around her middle. "Well, you've managed better than silly old me," Gwen said, flinching at another hit somewhere close by. "I've only gone to drop the box of matches in this mucky old puddle." Will whimpered. "Now we'll have to stay in the dark till Dad comes home." "I don't like the dark," Ruth said. "I can't look at my book in the dark." Gwen began to nudge them up. They were shivering, and she knew she would have to get them into dry things quickly. "We ain't had a candle for such a long time. I do believe I can see in the dark now, like an owl." Ruth began flapping her arms and hooting. Johnny and Will laughed and egged her on. Gwen picked herself up and guided the kids to their bunks. It was easy. She should have done it ages ago and not given in to her nerves. She felt her way to the storage box and dug to the bottom to find more matches. Johnny held the candle out, and when it was lit, they cheered. It was then she saw the torch, standing on the shelf above her mattress. She felt foolish and looked away, not wanting to draw the children's attention to it, but Johnny spotted it and grabbed it down. "It was here all along, Mum," he said. He played the beam across the wall. "Lots of silly things are happening tonight." She turned away from him. "Don't waste the battery now you found it. Come and get yourself into dry things." "Silly, Mum," Will said. "I'm very cold." Gwen threw a pile of clothes next to him and told him to start changing. She would be over to rub him with a towel when she'd taken care of Ruth. Minutes later, they were in warm things, blankets wrapped around them, looking through their Christmas annuals. The resounding din jarred and jolted through her, but for now she was in tenuous control, the ragged skin around her nails the only sign of her earlier panic. By 8:30, the boys were head to foot in the top bunk, Ruth tucked up underneath. They were quiet, but not asleep. When there was a lull, and surely there must be at some stage, they might drop off. Gwen swept the flooded rainwater towards the sump and watched it swirl away, then sat on the storage box and swapped her wet slippers for a dry pair. "When will Dad be home?" Ruth asked. "I want to kiss him night-night." "Yeah," Johnny said. "Where is Dad? It must be late." Gwen had been thinking the same thing. She picked up the clock and, turning away from them, shone the torch on its face. It was late for George, very late. But she said, "Oh, it ain't as late as it seems." Will rolled over and leaned on one elbow. "Show it to us," he said. She flicked off the torch. "No need. He'll be home soon." Will groaned and flopped back on the pillow. "The best thing you can do is go to sleep. Dad'll be tired when he gets in and he'll want to go straight to bed himself. He won't want to have you up adding to the commotion." "Dad likes seeing us," Ruth said. "Of course he does, love. But close your eyes now and he'll kiss you when he comes in. Then you can see him in the morning. Promise." Gwen listened to them fidgeting and making themselves comfortable. "Johnny," Will hissed, prodding his brother with his foot. "Johnny, there'll be lots of shrapnel tomorrow, won't there?" Johnny replied with a sleepy grunt. Probably some of it will still be warm. Hot, maybe. Red hot. Will you help me find some? Please. I ain't going to help you with anything ever again if you don't leave off your kicking. That's enough, boys, and we'll see what things are like in the morning before anyone goes anywhere. When they seemed to have settled a bit, she carried the candle to the small table wedged next to her bunk and thumbed through a notebook, meaning to write her list for tomorrow. She listened hard to pick up the familiar sounds of George coming home. A couple of times she thought she heard his whistle or his boots on the path, and she watched the door, willing it to open a crack and see him edge his bulk in around it. She pushed her glasses up and peered again at the clock, shaking it to prove it wasn't fast. George was on the day shift this week. He should have been home hours ago, and he watched last night, which meant he should have tonight off. Schedules and shifts were of no use now, though. She knew that. They couldn't be relied on, and that made waiting worse. But George was good, and on the nights when he wasn't going to be home, as predicted, he tried to send word. She didn't care if he started on about the kids again. She might even agree with him after tonight. She just wanted to know he was safe. She bit through the remedy varnish on her right thumbnail, and as it didn't taste too ghastly, worked her way along the fingers, then started on the other hand. A blast seemed to wrench the door open, and Gwen flew towards it to make sure it was secure, petrified yet desperate at the same time to see what was happening outside. But there was George. He pulled the door closed and stood, his uniform torn and his head and face covered in a greasy film of sweat and grey dust. Gwen could see his hands were scratched and bleeding, and there was a swollen bruise above his right eye. Bloody hell, he said. Gwen rushed towards him, and for a second he held her. She could feel his arms and shoulders twitching beneath his coat, but when she started to rub at them, he moved her to one side. I've only come in to make sure you're all right. Betty's taken a packet, so have the Smiths. No, not Betty. Shh, she's fine. But Len's not so good. They've been taken to hospital. He rubbed hard at his face. Is there a bowl of water? I'll clean the worst off for you. She turned to pull the first aid box out and saw all three kids awake and watching. George bent and murmured to them, tucking the blankets around the boys and rescuing Ruth's doll from the floor. Hurry! He sat next to her on the bed. I can't be long. The trains ain't still running, are they? He shook his head and talked in a low voice. We were told to leave the engines in a depot and get to our other posts. I left the train at Waterloo and made my way to the station. Bloody hell, Gwenny. It's an inferno, the whole damn place. She made a small noise but kept her tears in check. I know. Well, I can imagine, although I don't want to. There are hundreds of people out there, and still there ain't enough. Directly you start digging through some wreckage or beating at a fire, you turn and there's something more urgent to see to. And the noise. He hung his head, and his voice cracked. The screaming and shouting. He snatched his hands away and stood up. I'll take the torch and some of these bits and pieces, he said, grabbing at bandages and cotton wool. In amongst the supplies, Gwen found a scarf and wrapped it around his neck. She didn't plead with him to stay because she knew he wouldn't. Besides, she wouldn't be able to live with herself if he did. He kissed the top of her head and said he'd be back soon. He looked at the kids and mouthed, They'll have to go. She could feel the quiver in her lips. I know, she whispered. From the crack in the door, Gwen followed the light of his low torch. He made his way across the garden and around what looked like a crater where the fence joining them to number 51 had been. To the right was Betty's house, what was left of the kitchen and sitting room gaping and exposed. Above, like props on a stage, 2 German bombers were caught in the interweave of searchlight beams, a sentry line of barrage balloons floating beneath them. When she looked back for George's light, it was gone. She closed the door and blocked out the sight. Sitting on the edge of his bunk, Johnny was searching amongst his things. He had one shoe on as well as his trousers and a thick jumper. What do you think you're doing, young man? You can use the pot. I'll get it for you. I'm going with Dad, he said, tugging his other shoe out and pulling it on. Gwen was taken aback. "Oh, Johnny," she sat beside him. "You're very brave, but you can't. You know that. You're too young." She went to put an arm around him, but he pulled away. "I'm 10, and big for my age. You're always saying that." "That's right, love. You are. And that's why I need you here, especially when Dad ain't at home." He ignored her, still piling on his hat and coat. "I heard him say there ain't enough helpers." "That's enough now, Johnny." She meant this to be the last word. "Back into bed this instant. You'll wake Will and Ruth, and then we won't be able to have a biscuit and put a puzzle together. Just the two of us, will we?" But the others were sitting up, frightened looks on their faces, watching Johnny dress himself for the outdoors. Then she could not grasp what happened next. Johnny ran to the door and opened it with a clean blow to the latch. Gwen lunged at him and had his coat in her fist, but he twisted from her grip and bolted in the same direction his dad had taken. "Johnny!" she shouted, his name vanishing amidst all the others being screamed for in the night. Will and Ruth were crying, and Gwen turned back to them, then spun again and shrieked for Johnny. Will was getting out of bed. Gwen pushed him back, then plucked Ruth from her bunk and shoved her in with her brother. "I'll be back in 5 minutes," she said. "Stay here, together." "Don't leave us, Mum," Will said. "I have to, just for a bit. Be good and do not go anywhere. We'll be back very soon." She lurched through the same hole in the fence that George and then Johnny had run through, calling Johnny's name until her throat burned. Would he have turned left or right, run straight through the bomb site on the opposite side of the road, or doubled back towards the river? Nothing looked the same. All landmarks were gone, obliterated. Black holes where windows had been, odd bits of cutlery and chairs strewn along the pavement, a lamppost twisted and fizzing across the bar of the builder's arms. If she couldn't get her bearings, then how could a small boy? She gulped down his name, then screeched it out again. She flew across the road, tunnel vision blurring the flames and debris around her. When she reached the corner of Pier Street, her heart was pounding so hard it felt as though it was moving up through her chest to where she would heave it from her mouth. She had to stop and try to force it back down. Behind her, a handful of people were picking through the wreckage of Price's little grocery shop. She ran towards them, shouting, "Johnny! Johnny!" A few dirt-streaked faces looked up, the others too intent on their own miserable searches. "Mrs. Gregson?" Gwen recognised the voice of Evans and scrabbled her way towards him. He kept his torch down, where she could make him out, his badge glinting in the dark. He left what he was doing and caught her as she stumbled. "What's happened to your Johnny? And to you?" Gwen saw him look at her up and down, taking in the soaking slippers on her feet, the torn stockings stuck to her knees with blood, the apron still tied round her waist. "Have you taken a hit?" Evans asked, fumbling through his satchel for his notebook. "Have you seen Johnny?" Gwen's voice rose to a shrill, piercing pitch. "Has he run past here?" Now, Gwen," said Mrs. Price, "that won't help." The older woman put an arm around Gwen and tried to get her to sit on an upturned bucket. Gwen backed away from them and spun round. "He's trying to follow George." She sniffed at the tears and snot running down her face. "To help him." A boom, a blinding flash so close it distracted them, and for a moment they stood, arms covering their heads, backs hunched against the onslaught. Evans took her by the elbow. "I spoke to George not 5 minutes ago," he said. "He was heading back to his station and asked me to keep an eye on all of you." "And Johnny," Gwen sobbed. "You must have seen him. Which way did he go?" Evans shook his head. "Best thing you can do, my dear, is get back to the other two." "They're still indoors, are they?" Mrs. Price asked. "In the shelter." "With a neighbour?" Evans waited for Gwen to answer. Gwen shook her head. "On their own," then she remembered. "With the candle." "Come along now." Evans began to march her back the way she'd come. "But Johnny—" "Johnny will be safe and sound by now, drinking tea with George in the station. Let's get you home." With the prod of her elbow, Gwen escaped him. "Can't you send someone to check on Will and Ruth?" She swiped at the air. "My Johnny's out here by himself." "I'll go," said Mrs. Price. "I'll walk round." "No," Evan shouted as she staggered over the rubble. "Mrs. Gregson, be sensible!" From there, Gwen had meant to cross Mudshoot Park towards George's station, but she stumbled into Manchester Road, caught up in the surge of people rushing towards that terrific crash from a few moments ago. She could see that the whole bottom end of the thoroughfare was alight. Flames consuming the school, the sweet shop, the row of houses, the rope works, the post office. Every building was nothing more than a smouldering shell. And still the bombs exploded. Backwards and forwards she veered along the road. A wheel cracked and fell off a cart, narrowly missing her foot. She ran in front of a fire engine, then jumped out of the way of an ambulance manoeuvring around a lorry parked with both doors open. He wouldn't have come this way, not Johnny. Not unless he was very muddled or something had compelled him. This was the opposite direction from where his dad had been headed. But if she had come this way, moved along by the crowds and the noise, why wouldn't he have done the same?
End of CD 1. CD 2.
As she got closer, she could feel the heat from the fire and had to shield her face from the ashy soot that settled on her clothes like dirty grey sludge. She thought she saw a small figure darting towards the back of a blackened shed, but when she screamed out Johnny's name, she saw it was an elderly woman, round-shouldered in a huge dark coat. A good few people had formed a column and were shouting orders to each other as they passed buckets and hoses along the line. No one was allowed through the makeshift cordon, and Gwen found herself standing with a pitiful crowd, watching and waiting. She convinced herself that she wouldn't find Johnny here, and turned to make her way back through the side streets and alleys to George's station. Shivering, she stopped to draw her cardigan together, and heard voices in the crowd behind her call out. Then there was a hush. She looked to where their attention was drawn, and there, emerging through a charred doorway, was George. He walked as though he had a metal rod in his spine, his coat wrapped around a small body pressed hard against his chest. It must be someone else's kid, surely. Countless children wore the same shoes, had a scab above the dimple in their knee. Then she knew, and at once her retching sobs pierced the lull. Calling out their names, she threw herself towards them. But George looked straight ahead, and continued to walk through the crowd with the same measured pace, leaving Gwen to cling to his sleeve so she wouldn't fall to the ground. When she reached round to hold Johnny's hand, she found a tiny piece of shrapnel in his fist. They buried it in the coffin with him. During the long days and nights after the funeral, Gwen wondered how things could be so different and yet carry on around her in the same way. So many people had lost someone. She knew that. George's work pal lost 2 sons at Dunkirk. The woman at the end lost her baby early when her house caught a packet. But everyone else could blame their loss on the Germans, the government, the war in general, a loved one's bravery or stupidity. She alone was responsible for her own son's death, as sure as if she had murdered him. How she wished she had done something to him that was accountable in law, so that then she could shout, "Guilty, guilty," on every count, and find relief in the punishment. After the initial retelling, no one questioned her again or asked her to justify herself, not even George. But she tortured herself without respite, reliving every detail. She forced herself to think about what would have happened if, and in every imaginary outcome, Johnny was still there, rushing around with his football, working his tongue at the corner of his mouth as he frowned over his problems, swinging his legs under the chair while he ate his tea, breathing, laughing, teasing his brother, alive and warm beside her. If she hadn't hesitated at the end of the garden, if she hadn't stopped at Price's, if she'd let Evans resolve matters his way, she could feel Johnny's coat in her fist, and she was sure now that if she had just tightened her grip on it then. Over and over she twisted and turned through those last hours, until she reached the thought that gave her the most pain. Johnny should not have been in London. He should have been in Wales with his school pals, and that too had been her decision. George sat still in his chair for hours on end, an unopened paper on his lap. When he shuffled to the table for a meal or stared unblinking out of the window, Gwen found the stoop he'd developed unbearable, and she had to turn away. She thought he'd be angry with her or more. She waited for him to fly into a rage, shake her and call her names. Perhaps he would leave her and take a room somewhere close to the station, or shout that from then on he would be in sole charge of Will and Ruth. None of those things happened, but the slumping quiet was not characteristic either, and she thought his staged politeness was the only way he could control the hate he must have for her. One dismal afternoon, while the kids were upstairs, she went outside and heaved a wall of broken bricks and concrete against the door of the Anderson. She let the sharp edges tear at her hands, opening up the bitten sores until her fingers were bleeding and raw. She would never go in there again. George came out and stood watching, then turned away without saying a word and shut the door behind him. Weeks passed, each grey day indistinguishable from the last. The war raged on with cruel insensitivity. George returned to work and to his fire-watching duties, speaking but not really talking to her when he was at home. Gwen kept her eyes lowered, sure others in the shop queues must be talking about her. The food she cooked was flavourless. Buttons went unsewn on shirts and trousers. A bright, hopeful snowdrop dared to appear under the front window, and she kicked at it until it broke off at the root. One Sunday morning, Ruth helped her mother by putting slices of bread on a plate for breakfast as Gwen cut them off the loaf. 2 for Mum, 2 for Dad. She piled the slices on top of each other. When Gwen stopped cutting the loaf at 8, Ruth, still warm and puffy from sleep, looked around and said, "Ain't Johnny having toast?" Will tightened his mouth and nudged her under the table. "I forgot," she said, and buried her face in Gwen's neck. Gwen wished she could forget. She would gladly have abandoned everything were it not for Ruth and Will. She kept them close and made sure she was holding on to them whenever possible. At night, they sat under the stairs until the all clear. Then she put them into bed with her, entwining her arms and legs around theirs. Without protesting, George slept in Ruth's bed, unable, Gwen thought, to face Johnny's empty place behind the curtain on the boys' side of the room. By the end of February, Will was restless and took any opportunity to go to his room, with Ruth trailing behind more often than not. "They can't wait to get away from me," Gwen thought, "and I don't blame them." Sometimes she listened at the door to catch what they might be saying, but all she could make out were the sounds of play. Will stopped talking about Johnny and started asking questions about himself. "When am I going back to school, Mum?" Gwen felt the knot in her stomach tighten. "We think you should both stay home for a while, love," she said. "Then can I play out? Marty plays football every day before tea, with Richard and some of the others. Why can't I?" "You know why." He shook his head crossly. "They think I'm a baby, always stuck in with you." "It ain't forever, Will," she said. "Just until—" "When?" "The end of the war, when the bombing stops, if I can ever trust my judgment again." "Never." Those were the answers she wanted to give. Instead, she knelt next to him on the floor and rocked him. "Please, Mum," Will said. With the heel of his hand, he wiped at her tears. "I ain't going to run off like Johnny. Promise." "Let me talk to Dad," Gwen said. "And if he gives his permission, I'll take you back to school on Monday morning." Will let out a cheer and called up the stairs to Ruth. An hour after the raid ended, George came in and kicked off his boots. Gwen lay in bed and listened to the hiss of the gas under the kettle, the clatter as he took his plate from the oven. When she thought he'd be sitting down to eat, she put her dressing gown around her shoulders and went downstairs, creeping on her toes across the sitting room in the light from the kitchen. Not wanting to startle him, she put her head around the door and called softly. But his chair was empty, his food growing cold on the table. "George," she whispered again. She followed a noise from the pantry where she discovered him standing with his back to her, clutching the salt cellar in one hand, holding onto a shelf with the other. When he turned, she saw the rings under his eyes, the creases around his mouth, the swollen nose, chapped from crying. She took the salt from his hand and led him back to the kitchen. Talk to me, George, she said, pulling a chair close to his. He looked away. I don't care what you say. Nothing can make this any worse. Tell me you hate me. Say you wish it had been me. She grabbed his arm. Say it. George shook his head. He unpeeled her fingers from his shirt and placed a hand on the table. He looked down at his knees and into the corner above the meat safe, anywhere but at her. He hacked, as if something was caught in his windpipe. Then he said, That night, after I left you in the shelter. The clock ticked, and from a distance came the early sounds of clearing up. I can hear everything. See it all again. Do you know what I mean, Gwen? She nodded. I can't. He swiped at the tears caught in the black and grey of his unshaven chin. It was... A bed creaked in the room above, and George turned his face towards the noise. Go on, George. Please. It don't matter now. George stared, as if studying her after a long absence. Then his eyes narrowed. It won't bring him back. It did matter, though. To her it did. But all she could say was, Nothing will. As for them, George said, pointing upwards, they're going to Wales. She opened her mouth to tell him he was right, even though the idea petrified her. But he stopped her short. No discussion. No arguing. That's the end of it. Gwen had been mortified when it seemed that Betty wouldn't be able to move back into number 47. And there had been talk of her and Len staying with their daughter-in-law in Clapham. But the rubble was cleared, and when the side door and 2 windows were bricked over, the inspector gave permission for them to return. Gwen was so grateful for Betty, who split her time between seeing to Len and helping her organise the clothes and books the kids would need to take with them. They had a week to get things ready, but a year wouldn't have been long enough for Gwen to prepare herself to let the children go. Together, they darned socks and scrubbed collars, folded a change of clothes and pyjamas into 2 small suitcases. Soap and toothbrushes were rolled up in towels. Gwen wanted them to wear their best, so used some money she'd put aside to buy them each a coat and shoes. Will was wild with excitement, choosing first one book, then swapping it for another, and trying to wedge in his beloved tin Spitfire without denting the wings. Marty and Richard were the last of his schoolmates to leave for Wales, and he couldn't wait to meet up with them, and the other boys he hadn't seen for weeks. Ruth was less happy. Sometimes she copied Will's boisterous preparations, but most days she wanted to sit on Gwen's lap, or trail along after her, clutching her knitted doll. There was no question of exchanging Susie for a game or a puzzle, so Betty dressed the doll in a new outfit for the occasion, sewn together from the scraps of her old armchair, which had been salvaged from the hit. On the Saturday afternoon, before they were due to leave, Gwen put on a special tea. Even though the thought of eating anything turned her stomach, she wanted the children to have something nice to remember about their last day at home. George was late on the trains and couldn't change his shift. At least, that was what he said. So Betty came in and tried to jolly them along. The custard was burnt, the tea was weak, and Will did most of the talking. "Will they ask about Johnny?" he blurted out. Gwen had no idea what, if anything, the children from Johnny's class had been told. "What will I tell them?" he asked. Ruth looked at Gwen, her lips trembling. "I don't want to talk about Johnny. It makes Mum cry. And Dad." Gwen knew that Betty was waiting for her to come up with an answer, but she couldn't lift her eyes from her plate. "You tell them your Johnny was a very brave boy," Betty said at last. "A proper little hero, and it was all Hitler's fault. Ain't that right? Gwen?" Gwen pushed a bit of greasy sausage around her plate, then stabbed it with her fork. A horrible couple of hours passed before Betty scraped her chair back and said, "Well, my dears, I best get back to Len. Make sure he's behaving himself. You know what a terror he can be." She held her arms out to the children. "Give us a hug, then." Ruth wrapped her arms around Betty, but Will stood back, holding his hand out to shake hers when Ruth released her grip. "Is that all I get, young sir?" Betty asked, forcing his head into her chest. "You're almost up to my shoulder, ain't you? Look at him, Gwen." Will stood tall and measured himself against Betty. "Almost," he said. "Next time I say you, I expect you'll be up here somewhere." She marked an imaginary height inches above her head. "And I'll be just there." Ruth stood on her toes and touched Betty's nose. "Don't forget your promise," Betty said. "Write to me and I'll write back." Gwen followed Betty into the kitchen. She wanted to get the bath out and filled before the siren. At the door, Betty looked down at the cases and masks ready for the morning. "Are you all right now, Gwen?" she asked. "Is there anything else I can do for you tonight?" "You've been a great help, Betty," Gwen said, the tears starting again. "There ain't nothing more you or anyone else can do." "Maybe you could think about getting some kind of work, you know, to keep yourself busy." "Oh, Betty." Gwen dragged her hands through her hair, pulling out a pin and putting it in her apron pocket. "That's the last thing I can think about right now. I don't mean this minute." Betty stopped Gwen's fingers short of her sharp teeth and cupped them in her hands. "But soon you might have to. Len's mate left his paper when he came to visit, and in it there was a list of jobs for ladies. I couldn't believe it. Might as well choose something you like the sound of before you get given the dregs." "I've got enough to be getting on with right now," Gwen said. "You can't sit around here all day and night brooding. You'll make yourself ill." Gwen unwound her hands from Betty's and folded her arms, standing away from the door to let Betty pass. "Tarbet," she said. "I'll get tomorrow over and done with first." The blackouts were drawn, and the copper full of water was heating on the stove. Gwen dragged the bath in front of the fire and draped nightclothes and towels over the guard. Will was racing around the sitting room, acting out the flight of a plane from takeoff to landing, with all the stages and noises in between. She moved in slow motion, fussing over details, trying to hold back the clock. This would be the last time for ages that she would be helping Will and Ruth get ready for their baths. She hated the thought that tomorrow someone else would be in charge of her kids, but she despised herself for not having done this for Johnny. "What was that noise, Mum?" Ruth asked. "Wasn't it just Will being a plane?" "A different noise," Will said. "From the kitchen." Perhaps George had leave to come home after all, Gwen hoped. But no one was there, although it was obvious Betty had been back because spread open at the page she'd been talking about was a copy of the Labour Gazette. Ambulance drivers, land army, builders, postwomen. The list went on. Betty meant well. Gwen was sure of that. And she couldn't want for a better friend, so would hate to offend her. She would read the article next week and then be able to tell Betty she had done so. But for now, she folded the paper, tucked it behind a vase on the sideboard, and made sure the towels were warm enough to wrap around her children. Coming back to an empty house, with rations for two, was one of the hardest things Gwen had to endure. The silence screamed at her. The walls ranted about Johnny and what she should or shouldn't have done for him, questioned the decision she'd made about Will and Ruth, chided her about the lack of kindness between her and George. When she reached the point where she thought she would wail aloud, her hands pinned to her ears, she would escape to Betty's, or the library or the park. Then she would have to once more steel herself to unlock the door and step into the abyss of her family home. It took 2 weeks to clean almost every inch of the house, and Gwen knew that when she'd finished, she would start all over again. She left the children's room as it stood, unable to face the toys, books and clothes that lay in the exact positions the kids had placed them. If she moved things, the children's fingerprints on them would be lost forever. If she left them to gather dust, they would remind her of their last days at home. So best to leave the door closed tight against her eyes, her nose, and the touch of her hands. Despite that, she came across evidence of them in the least likely places. Right at the back of a cupboard, under the sink, she found a jam jar full of brown river water, a couple of inches of green scum on the surface. Will had been sure it was populated with tadpoles, but none had materialised. A button from Susie's dress appeared in the corner of the stairs on the landing. She tore down and ripped up the football chart that Johnny and Will had filled in, without fail, every Saturday afternoon. A couple of pieces of Meccano Johnny had searched for to complete an intricate model of a crane were behind the clock on the mantelpiece. She sat with each item she found, nursing it in her hands and remembering when she had last seen her child using it, or the outing they had been on when they gathered the stone or stick or leaf. Their faces came back to her in detail. She could picture the way they moved their mouths, their hands, their eyes. Will had a way of blowing upwards so his hair fluttered away from his forehead. Ruth would rub her eyes with her knuckles when she tried too hard. Johnny would tap his fingers while he thought about his arithmetic or drawing or what to make with his construction set. One dull afternoon, Gwen could feel her arms and legs heavy with fatigue, as if concrete had replaced muscle and bone, but she could not stop. Moving a bowl, some knitting patterns and a vase from the sideboard, she saw a newspaper fall to the floor. At first, she didn't recognise it as George's Daily. Then she could see it was that Labour Gazette Betty thought she was doing her a favour by bringing round. The sight of it brought back the memory of the day before Will and Ruth went away, and Gwen scrunched it hard to use on the fire later. But then the tears began again. Weariness flooded through her, and she thought that she would have to sit for 10 minutes. In George's chair she closed and opened her eyes, needing rest but frightened of the nightmares that marred her sleep. She unfolded the paper on her lap and found the page Betty had asked her to read. The list of jobs women could do now spread out over 4 pages. She took up a pencil from the side table and tried to imagine herself in each of the advertised jobs. She put a cross through every job except one: construction. Not that she was keen on that either, but Johnny would be proud to think of her amongst the cranes and spanners and scaffolding. And it was either that or sit here, where the quiet could not get any louder, the skirting boards cleaner, or the absent children more vivid. Chapter 3. December 1940. Joan. In the limbo between unconsciousness and waking, Joan imagined her mother nursing her through chickenpox, scarlet fever, or some other childhood illness. Mother checking her pulse, mother stroking her hands, mother wiping her forehead, mother stroking her hands, always worrying about her hands. She was no longer that child, but she sensed that mother was nearby, assuring herself that Joan's hands were in perfect order above anything else. Then she drifted away again to a picture of herself in Ralph's study. There by the window, she saw the 3-legged table on which he threw his watch, cufflinks, loose change, and other paraphernalia when he had finished his duties for the day. A lavishly inlaid bureau stood against the wall on the left, and Joan could make out the documents waiting to be filed on its open-hinged jaw. One afternoon, she wrenched the door open in her eagerness to see him after a week's absence, and sent the whole lot up into the stratosphere of the high ceiling. Afraid to look at the reaction on Ralph's face, she'd clamped her hands over her mouth and watched as pages fluttered down around them like sycamore pods. Ralph laughed then and held out his arms to her. In her relief at not having spoiled the reunion, she'd stomped all over the reports and lists settling on the maroon and green patterned carpet. He'd patted his lap, and she'd nestled into him, her hands tracing the lines of his face. The imperceptibly receding hairline, high curved cheekbones, his asymmetrical nose, thickened on one nostril by a childhood scar, the dark, coarse moustache above the mouth that she'd heard others in the orchestra describe as malevolent. Snorting, he'd snatched her fingers between his teeth, slobbering over them, teasing them between biting and sucking. Acting coy, she'd withdrawn her hands and buried them between her thighs and his. Now, she'd said. Can't you hear Mother? And she'd aped her mother's mantra. Joan, please, dear, mind your hands. He'd laughed at that, the warmth of his chest and belly rising and falling against hers. I'd love to tell your mother what those hands of yours get up to, he'd said. But shall I help you to be ever such a good girl this time and do as she says? and as he'd manoeuvred her to the leather sofa, he'd circled both her wrists with one of his hands and held them stretched out above her head. But when she came to, she was in the bedroom that had been hers since childhood, and which could not have been more different from Ralph's study. Mother's favourite pastels were prominent here on the cushion covers and vanity table skirt, reclaimed from curtains taken down to make way for the blackouts. Putting aside her embroidery, Mother rose from the chair where she had been keeping watch, and Joan felt acrid disappointment rise from her stomach like bile when she saw Mother's face, rather than Ralph's, hover into view. Mother reached for a hand, but Joan turned away and let her fingers wilt on the outstretched palm. Then pictures of Mother administering the orange juice and castor oil 3 days earlier came creeping back. They broke through the flimsy lines of defence sleep had contrived. Mother had lifted the concoction of tepid syrup to Joan's lips and instructed her to hold her nose as she gulped it down, so the cloying mixture could begin its lethal task before she could taste it and spit it out. "Now this, dear," Mother had said, encouraging a tumbler of gin to Joan's mouth as if she were offering her a pre-dinner cocktail. 24 hours later, enfeebled by merciless cramps, Joan hung her limp head over an old pail, clutching it in order to give her a sense of stability. "Your hands, Joan," Mother ordered. "Relax your fingers." If she'd had the strength, she would have delighted in hurling the bucket and its contents over Mother's pristine facade. Of course, when Joan had admitted the pregnancy to Mother, the details of her love affair with Ralph had been bullied out of her too. Joan had expected Mother to be angry. She and Father had, after all, invested hundreds of pounds in her career, not to mention, which Mother often did, the time and energy and sacrifices at the altar of pursuits, holidays, and assets of their own. When Joan reminded Mother that at 7 years old she'd had the violin foisted on her, Mother retorted that Joan had begged to learn to play. "Of course I did," Joan shouted. "Little girls always want to mimic their mothers. But you never let it go, not for 1 minute." "No, I didn't, because I have diligence and dedication. Pity you didn't copy those assets. If I'd had your chances, I would never have given them up for a sordid little entanglement." They'd spent their days arguing. "You will be ruined," Mother would say over and over, like a scratch 78 record. Mother was petrified for Joan's reputation, but there was no doubt in Joan's mind that Mother's main dread was not for her standing as a young woman, but for her musical career. According to Mother, the only possible thing Joan could do was get rid of the baby. "We can put it behind us," she said. "Look at your hands, Joan. They're still perfect, aren't they? That's all you need to worry about." If only that was the case. The absurdity of Mother's thinking and the dilemma Joan battled with reduced her mind to a mushy pulp. She hadn't yet told Ralph about the baby and could not decide if she should. If he knew, he might break off their affair and she would have to revert to her life before him. Inconceivable. If she got rid of the baby with the help Mother persistently offered, then at least she and Ralph would continue as before. That was some comfort. But there was one other possibility, one she almost dare not imagine, even though the picture of it would not leave her alone. If she told Ralph now, before it was too late, he might leave his wife for her and the child. As each night fell, she and Mother called a truce. They huddled on opposite ends of the sofa in the drawing room, the bickering and squabbles put on hold as they tried to drown out the wailing of sirens and bombing strikes, with Mozart or Beethoven on the gramophone. It was war inside and out. So acute was the feeling of entrapment that Joan often found it difficult to move or take a proper breath. Ralph would have found the indignity of the situation insufferable. Sir Ralph Myers's induction speech to the newly appointed musicians, sitting at the back of the hall, intimated that he would never tolerate a spectacle. Joan felt childish pride as she imagined his praise was meant solely for her. "You've done well to get here. Do you know how many talented musicians auditioned for these positions?" As one many-headed creature, they shook their heads. "Come along now," he tutted. "Please don't tell me I've erred and chosen shy, unforthcoming music makers after all." The world around us may be rapidly slipping into indecorous chaos, but it is up to us, indeed up to you, to counteract that decline and smooth the population's way back to a more genteel, civilised way of life, through the genius of harmony and the soul of music." He swept his arm behind him to encompass the painted cupola above the stage, his suit jacket splaying open to expose the gold fob chain swinging against his golden embroidered waistcoat. Again, as if their heads were joined and in turn connected to his hand, like puppets to their master, they followed the arc of his elegant fingers. "You, young man." He pointed to the sandy-haired boy sitting next to Joan, his soft pale hands spread with vigilance on his knees. "How many?" 2,000, perhaps, the boy stuttered. Joan cringed for him as she felt rather than saw the mortified heat rising from his freckled face. There was a moment's silence in which the great man waited. Joan nudged the boy and whispered to him. "Sir Ralph," he shouted out with relief, his discomfort coming to an end. "Thank you, young man." Ralph conceded, but when he tipped his head it was, Joan was sure, to acknowledge her. "Now, to put the record straight. There were 157 auditions for the places on this very stage." He stamped his foot lightly, then paused to let the resonance abate. "Some of them I sent back to school, as music masters or mistresses. Some I steered to regimental bands, and a few lucky applicants I encouraged to try again next year. From you, even more fortunate candidates, I expect the following: loyalty to the endeavour of creating superb music, loyalty to the hall, to each other, and to me, punctuality, no excuses, decorum in your speech and manner when on duty here for a performance or rehearsal. You will each receive an invitation in your pigeonhole to meet with me in my study sometime during the next fortnight. Rehearsals start at 9 o'clock Monday morning." They watched as he walked down the aisle between them and through a row of red velvet seats towards a door at the back of the hall, stopping to rub a mark from an armrest. Then he disappeared into the warren of corridors that led to his suite of offices. "Thanks," the boy said, delicately running a finger around his collar. "He's ferocious, don't you think?" Joan shrugged. "I thought he was commanding." "I'll say. That and demanding." He held out his sallow hand, and they shook, his touch as insipid as hers. "What are you?" "Violin, and it's Joan. How about you?" "Hello, Joan Violin. I'm Colin Cello. Do you fancy a drink?" He motioned to a group of 5 or 6 others standing about talking. Some of them mentioned it earlier. When Joan hesitated, he said, "No rehearsals until Monday, so the smell will have dissipated by then." Joan laughed and pictured Mother's disapproving face when Joan partaking of alcohol was mentioned. Mother, on the other hand, never turned down a drop. She sighed and decided not to chance Mother's indignation. "I'll have a cordial. I don't drink." The chance to stay out a bit later pleased her, and she could always say the tube was disrupted or the bus had to take another route because of the bombing. Besides, Mother would only insist she crack on with her practice the minute she got home. And there was enough time for all that over the weekend, stranded alone with her in the house. Every evening and weekend had been the same as far as Joan could remember, since she'd first asked to have a little go on Mother's violin. It was as if Mother was possessed from that moment on, organising lessons, insisting on practice before reading or homework or exploring the garden or skipping rope. Her stomach still tightened into a knot of despondency when she recalled having to turn down an invitation to a friend's birthday tea because Mother said, "No, Joan has a great musical future ahead of her and can't afford to diverge from her practice schedule." Of course, the friend never asked again. There were many hilarious impersonations of Sir Ralph and William Benson, who was to be their conductor, that night in the pub. Colin surprised all of them, Joan thought, with his aptitude for the theatrical and the ease with which he laughed at himself, making a comic turn of his earlier humiliation. He even managed to draw Joan into the pantomime by getting her to whisper to him again on cue. "Next time, though, Joan Violin, I do wish you wouldn't elbow me quite so hard. You managed to get me right in the spot where I snuggle my beloved Cecilia." "Aye, aye," said Edward. "And when might we get to meet this girl of yours?" "Monday next, 9 o'clock." Colin half closed his eyes and feigned rapture. "Cecilia Cello, my one and only." Everyone admitted to the pet names for their instruments, Jones being the uninspired Violet. By the time they'd had a couple of rounds, they had formed quite a little band, comfortable enough with each other to arrange to meet up again after the first rehearsal. Eileen, a tall girl with cornflower blue eyes set off by dark arched brows, suggested they go to see Top of the World at the Palladium. "Let's book seats then," Colin said. "I've wanted to see that show for the longest time," Joan said. She was delighted with the prospect, made more attractive by the fact that Mother, who would never consent, need not know. The outing to the Palladium went ahead in November, Colin somehow managing to secure 5 seats together and a 6th just behind. As it turned out, that lone seat wasn't needed. By then Joan was involved with Ralph, and they were ensconced together in his dark study. The following morning, Edward and Eileen performed a great take on one of the showstoppers, and Joan encouraged Colin to top it, but he shook his head and chastised her for wasting a ticket. He avoided her after that, and she was left trying to shake off the touch of shame she felt when he walked away from her, hands in pockets. Things would have been very different, she supposed, if she'd stuck with Colin and his crowd. She thought they must be wondering how she was recovering from the acute gastroenteritis Mother had alerted the company to in a letter. She'd finished with a postscript, advising that for the sake of their health, they shouldn't visit, and none went against her warning. Much to Joan's alarm, that included Ralph. The invitations from Sir Ralph had appeared in their pigeonholes, as promised, the day formal rehearsals began. Joan's slot was the last, Friday week at 3 o'clock. She would have liked to get it over and done with earlier, but at least this way she could grasp the format of the meetings from the others and be prepared. As the fortnight progressed, everyone reported back on the more or less identical 15-minute discussion with Sir Ralph, with the exception of Colin, who wiped his brow and contorted himself into a sham fit. Everyone came out looking brighter than they had going in. Having watched all of this take place, Joan was feeling less anxious by the time she knocked on Sir Ralph's door at the allotted time. "Enter," he called. Joan closed the door behind her and stood with her back to it, waiting to be summoned forward. Without looking up from what he was reading, Sir Ralph pointed to a hard, straight-back chair across the desk from him. Hands clasped in her lap, and her back as rigid as the unwelcoming chair she perched on, Joan sat and waited. Not daring to move her head in case she distracted him, she looked out the corner of her eye at the certificates on the wall next to her. Then she took in some of the photos on the drinks cabinet to the right, all of them picturing Sir Ralph shaking some dignitary's hand and smiling with reticence, as if he had something more pressing to undertake elsewhere. A woman with sleek hair and sharp features stood behind his right shoulder in 2 of the photos, wearing a different stylish hat in each shot. "Don't mind those," Sir Ralph said. Joan pivoted her eyes back towards him and felt herself start to colour, knowing he'd observed her prying. "They're nothing. Nothing important, that is." "Pardon me, Sir Ralph," she said, shifting in her chair and looking, she was sure, as awkward as she felt. "You have nothing to be pardoned for, Miss Sir." He made a show of rooting amongst his papers for one particular sheet. "Abbott," Joan said. "Yes, Miss Abbott," he repeated, letting the page drop from his hand. "Now, tell me a bit about yourself. And please, don't tell me what I already know. All the others did that. Spewed out a repetitious reflux of the information on their application forms, or what they told us at audition. You're my last interviewee, and I'm bored with it now. Be different. Impress me." Joan felt bewildered and could think of nothing to say. This was not going to the plan she'd drawn up based on reports from the others. She half rose from the chair and said, "I think perhaps I should come in again and start over." It had been a serious suggestion, so she was surprised at the laughter that followed, and which went on for some time. Sir Ralph rocked backwards and forwards with delight like the torso of a laughing policeman at the funfair. Watching him, Joan experienced the same mixture of fear, repulsion and fascination she'd felt as a child, having fed her last penny to the strange marionette. When his amusement ebbed, he leaned back in his chair and studied Joan for a few uncomfortable moments. "Well, let me ask you this, perhaps safer question. What has been the highlight of your career to date?" Joan felt as though she'd lost her place in a score and was the only musician playing on the incorrect page. "I suppose getting my place here? At the Hall, Sir Ralph?" "And suppose you hadn't? What would your answer have been then?" Joan thought back through her musical achievements. "Well, Sir Ralph, it would have to be playing first violin at the RCM leaving ceremony." Yes, he nodded. "A great honour. We've had more than one first from that particular concert playing here, you know." Joan hadn't known that, and felt rather short-changed to be reminded that she was one of many. "But tell me, when you played in that performance, did you wear your hair as it is now?" Joan felt she was again sifting through her muddled sheet music with desperation. Her hand went without thinking to her head to check the pins that held the coiled rolls off her face. Everything was in place, held fast with the dollop of umami. Sir Ralph watched her agitation, a smile beginning to form on his face. She thought she might have to bolt for the door if his unnerving mirth surfaced again. "I'm sure I can't remember." "I certainly hope you did. It's most becoming." His voice was softer, more kindly. "In fact, there is nothing about your aspect that isn't." Joan felt compelled to go with the course of the conversation. "Well, now I think about it, I probably dressed it in a knot, which is much less distracting than having it down when playing." He held his hand up to stop her. "Miss Abbott, I'm paying you a compliment, and as I don't do so often, allow me to continue." "Pardon me again, Sir Ralph." "I don't expect you to be flattered." But she wasn't. She was more mystified than anything. She'd always considered herself rather plain, unlike Eileen, who managed to have every man's eyes on her whenever she walked into a room. Next to her, Joan felt her lack of curves and the thin legs that barely filled her stockings. Her hair was the same shade of brown as stewed tea, and she knew her eyes to be small, which was just as well, as their colour was an indistinct grey, like the seaside on a rainy bank holiday, nothing to get excited about. "I have no doubt," Sir Ralph said with some hesitation, as if he were struggling for the right words, "that you are admired as a matter of course by every young man you meet. Accolades from a man approaching middle age probably mean nothing to you." Joan dismissed the idea with a short laugh, as she hadn't socialised with many young men, Mother saying there was enough time for all that after her career had been established. The young men she did come into contact with never commented on her within hearing, so Joan assumed there was nothing much attractive about her, and concentrated on looking neat rather than glamorous. Besides, she told herself, these young men, whose compliments were supposed to be so longed for and highly prized, were mere boys, gangly and clumsy. Good fun, like Colin and Edward, she had to admit, but no more than that. "You seem so level-headed, too," Sir Ralph continued, looking down at his folded hands. "The majority of good-looking women are frivolous and prone to histrionics. You give the impression, however, of judiciousness. That, together with your beguiling demeanour, compels me to ask you to join me from time to time for a sherry and a chat about your burgeoning career. Would there be any chance of that, or am I asking too much?" Joan didn't know what she'd been expecting to find in Sir Ralph's face when he looked up, but it was not the sincerity she saw there. Of course it was Mother's fault that Joan jumped him feet first. Mother, with her incessant nagging about strict routines and the future, a future that Joan felt she hadn't had a chance to decide upon for herself. If the idea of seeing top of the world behind Mother's back was exciting, the thought of being with Ralph, and all the furtiveness that went with it, was thrilling. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Good." Sir Ralph nodded. "Let's start now. Dry or sweet?" He turned to the cabinet, and moved the photos to one side to reach the bottles behind. She didn't know the difference, but plumped for the one she thought would be most palatable. "Sweet, please." "Is that your wife? She's very elegant." He hesitated before picking up and studying one of the photos in which Lady Myers stood beside him. When he placed it back, he angled it so Joan couldn't see it with ease. "Yes, she spends a great deal of time keeping in vogue." Joan started to ask whether Ralph's wife was involved in music, but Ralph held up his hand to silence her, once more the director. "I invited you to have a sherry with me, not to discuss my wife." So she wasn't mentioned again. Joan pushed her and Mother to the back of her mind and relished the time she spent with Ralph, instigating their meetings as often as he did, and feeling more free than she had ever felt before. Besides all that, after the briefest of times, she was in love with Ralph, and thought he must feel the same about her. Mother was fussing now, having perceived that Joan was shamming sleep, and tried to hoist her up with one arm around her shoulder and the other wedged under her armpit. "Are you able?" Mother asked. "I think you should try to sit up now and eat something." Joan turned her pillows and punched them into shape, seeking a spot that wasn't slick with sweat. A square on the edge of the top pillowcase brought her some comfort, and she bunched it under her head, turning her back on Mother. Beneath the bedclothes, dishevelled and clammy around her legs and arms, she sought out her stomach and stroked its hollows. It was gone. She knew it with fevered clarity. Without the baby, so too were her fragile hopes for a future with Ralph. At very best, they would go back to how they were. Better than nothing, but not enough. Mother appeared again, carrying a tray around the bed. "This won't do, Joan dear. At least have a look. There's a lovely bowl of oxtail soup, a bread roll with both our rations of butter, a bit of cake and jelly. It's all very nutritious." "Please, leave me alone, Mother," Joan said. She heard the chink of crockery as Mother placed the tray on the bedside table, smoothed the bedclothes, and sat down next to her. Tentatively, Mother lifted the sheets from Joan's hands where they lay, one on each side of her head, and with gentle strokes began to massage them, starting with the fingers. Joan thought Mother must have mistaken her inertia for compliance, perhaps even solace, because her pummelling became more firm and confident. Joan kept her eyes closed, willing Mother to stop and leave the room. With a slight movement of impatience, Joan slipped her grip. Mother's hands fumbled for hers again and clung on, the thumb finding the spaces between the joints and digging down, seeking out sore spots she could worry away at. Something liquid trickled between Joan's legs, and she knew she needed to get up and see to herself, but felt weighted to the bed. Unable to move from the shape she'd created by her own damp, she felt a fury building up that she hadn't realised she had the energy to release. In the silence, Joan felt Mother lean towards her and suck in her breath, ready to speak. "Joan," she whispered. Joan shuddered when she felt Mother so close, and drew herself up on one elbow, intending to make the effort to get up. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything you've worked for. Move. Please, Mother. Move out of my way. Everything you've always wanted." Mother's voice was modulated and calm, as if she was trying to hypnotise Joan into agreement. "Surely you can see you've got that the wrong way round, Mother." Joan emphasised her words with sarcasm, balling the bedsheets in her fists to keep her composure. "It's what you've always wanted. I haven't had a choice." "Release the tension," Mother said, unclenching Joan's hands. "I have to get up." Joan felt feeble and shaky. She prodded Mother's arm, giving her an opportunity to stand and let her pass. Mother wouldn't take the hint, and with her last vestige of strength, Joan lashed out, slapping the back of her hand against Mother's cheek. Mother let out a cry and protected her face with her arm. Joan went to push her from the bed, shouting for her to get away, but Mother jumped back and stood staring at Joan in horror. The Westminster clock chimed 6, and rather than distract Joan, it spurred her on, and she gained momentum as the first explosion of the night struck. With one swing, Joan swept the tea tray in Mother's direction, making sure that shards of china and bits of food reached her intended target. "Joan, stop!" Mother screamed. "Have you gone mad? I don't know you anymore." Next, Joan tackled the vanity table, throwing bottles and jars at the door. Mother scrabbled towards to make her escape. Behind her eyes, bright floating lights were appearing, and Mother's voice sounded thin and distant. With one last effort, Joan wrenched the oil painting of a violinist from the wall and hurled it to the floor, catching the side of her hand on a nail that protruded from the frame. "Your hand! Joan, how could you?" Mother let out a sob as they watched the blood trail down Joan's arm from the jagged tear. A couple of weeks later, as Joan and Mother sat looking at each other over dinner, Mother related the excuses she'd given to Dr. Thompson when she'd called him out after the events of that contentious evening. Joan tried to stop the narrative, embarrassed by the memory of her conduct, but Mother insisted Joan needed to be able to piece things together. Joan let her gabble on. What difference did it make now? The doctor had given her something for the fever as well as a tonic for the long, heavy cycle Mother told him Joan was experiencing. "You might well look as if you couldn't care less one way or another at the moment, Joan dear. But you'll thank me in time for protecting your reputation, believe me. Father, of course, knows nothing, and he never will he? I'll tell him what I told the doctor and leave it at that. As for the wreckage in your bedroom, well, the bombing was terrible that night. I wrote and explained that the foundations of the house had been shaken by a particularly nasty raid. We'll stick with that, shall we?" "Yes, Mother." "And what did you tell them about my hand?" she asked, looking down at the bandage. "I said you slipped and fell on a broken cup." Joan nodded. Mother could have told Father that Joan had sliced her hand open shaving her beard, or that she had been helping a friend train as a knife thrower and had her hand pinned to the rotating board, or had been scything wheat or disemboweling a partridge, or she could have told him the truth. It would not have mattered or made any difference. Father would not have come home to inquire about her health. She could not remember him once touching her face or stroking her hair, and he would never question Mother about anything, accepting her rules and directions without a murmur. Sometimes, on the rare occasions he was home, he would look with pity at Joan when Mother started her endless nagging about rehearsals and lessons and her career. But when Joan begged him with her eyes for help or intervention, he just looked the other way. It was a wonder to Joan that he had made it to captain during his career in the RAF. She laughed to herself when she pictured the looks on the faces of his men if they could see him acquiescing to Mother on each and every minor point of their lives. But remorse overwhelmed Joan. She tried to hold back the images of her dreadful behaviour, but they pushed their way through with harsh persistence. She recoiled away from them into a corner of the chair, but still they came on, making her feel hot with chagrin. She thought about saying something, perhaps asking Mother's forgiveness, but felt that Mother had much to apologise for first, and, as she no doubt felt the same way, neither of them made a move towards the other. "Well," Mother said, "you're looking better these past few days. I believe there's some colour in your face. Are you feeling stronger?" "A bit," Joan said, turning her face to the weak sun, managing to seep through the clouds, stout with snow. Mother looked at Joan for a time. "You must think me awfully heartless." Joan was glad when Mother didn't give her time to answer. Mother came to kneel beside her, brushing the serviette from her lap and looking up into Joan's eyes. "I'm going to show you something now that you have to know about. I hope, after you see it, you'll be able to face the truth and get on with things as before." "What can you mean?" Joan asked, already imagining a letter from Ralph that perhaps Mother had opened and hidden from her. Mother unlocked a drawer in the sideboard and took out a folded newspaper. She took a deep breath and placed it on Joan's lap. "Page 24, she said. Then she turned and left the room with soft, quick footsteps. For a moment, Joan sat very still. A bird pecked through the wintry garden mire, then flew, disappointed, to try its luck in the barren hedge. In the distance, a man shouted, followed by the loud noise of something heavy falling. Clouds engulfed the sunshine, and a few darts of rain gave way to spatterings of snow. Joan turned the paper over and saw that it was dated Friday, the 30th of December, 1940. the day after that terrible scene with Mother. "The Second Fire of London," the headline read. With controlled movements, she leafed through each sheet until she arrived at the instructed page, in the middle of the Arts and Entertainment section. She peeled the pages apart, and there was a photo of Ralph, smiling through the grainy newsprint, his hand lifted as if to fend off the reporters. On his left was his wife, looking sophisticated in a feathery hat that swept low over one eye. "Sir Ralph to be new musical director of the ABC SSO," the headline read. Sydney. He'd never mentioned the possibility. Joan let the paper fall. Then she scrambled for it again and read through the first paragraph. Ralph had been in negotiations for this post for ages. With a jolt, she realised that she would have made no difference to his taking it up, pregnant or not. She couldn't bear to read the rest of the article, learn about his new beginnings and his aspirations for the musical life of Sydney. She crumpled the paper and threw it towards the fire. Mother appeared holding out a handkerchief. Joan snatched it and wiped it around her face as they stood facing each other in the pallid light from the thickening snow. "I'm sorry for all you've been through, Joan dear," Mother said, taking a small step in her direction. Joan turned and looked out over the fence at the end of the garden, across the allotments, and as far as possible above the line of trees surrounding the park. There were thousands and thousands of miles between her and Sydney. She imagined what her life might have been if Ralph had asked her to go with him, if in time it would have been her at his side for presentations and opening nights, if the child would have favoured him or her, and if there would have been any more. How it would have felt to have an ocean between her and Mother. And that was it, Joan thought. Turning back to the gloomy sitting room, that was the real heartbreak. Going back to things exactly as they were before she'd managed to grab something for herself with Ralph. Mother plucked Joan's violin from its case and, balancing it across her forearms, walked with reverence towards Joan. Without a word, she nudged the instrument across the space between them. Joan took it from her and edged it back, placing it in Mother's hands. Mother pushed it forward again, this time with more force. Again, Joan sent it back. "Don't be silly, Joan," Mother said. "Take it." This time Joan put her hand up to stop the violin's progress towards her. "What else is there now? You're not going to let that Svengali win, are you?" "Svengali?" Joan snorted. "I loved every minute of the time I spent with Ralph. It was wonderful. Please don't kid yourself that he had to beg me, Mother." "That can't be possible." Mother looked as though Joan had hit her a second time. "For some perverse reason, you're trying to shield him, but it's too late for all that. He's not coming back, and I insist that you get on with your career." Joan thrust her hands under her arms. She knew she had to keep her voice steady, so she wouldn't stoop to another hideous scene. "I will never play the violin again," she said, enunciating each word clearly and looking straight at Mother. "But Joan," Mother's voice was pleading, "I do wish I could understand why." She let the violin dangle by her side. Perhaps, Joan thought, I have never really explained myself properly. She had huffed and puffed, sighed, sulked and shouted. But had she ever sat down and told Mother in plain words how she felt? "Mother," Joan said, softening her voice, "let's sit for a minute." She guided Mother to the couch and sat beside her. "The violin." Mother's face furrowed. "I don't think playing was ever my first choice of hobby or career." Mother sat up, ramrod straight and her features flattened. "Then what was your first choice?" "Well, that's where the dilemma arises," Joan said, taking care not to lose control of her patience. "I was never given the chance to think about anything else I might like to do, or might be good at, as I was always made to concentrate on the violin." "That's because, Joan dear, you showed such aptitude when first you picked it up." Mother's shoulders slumped. "I thought I was helping you, encouraging you." "I would like my own life, Mother, not yours." Joan looked away, but could feel Mother tense beside her. "And now, besides all that," her voice stuck in her throat, It will remind me too much of Ralph. And I couldn't bear it." Joan reached out for Mother's hand, but Mother withdrew hers to her own lap. "So," Mother tightened her eyes until they tapered, "it's all my fault, just as it's always been. At least now I can share that burden with Sir Ralph Myers. But, Joan dear, you are worth so much more than him, and I would implore you," she produced the violin yet again, "do not give this up for a man like that." Joan had tried so hard, and she could not believe that Mother was not meeting her at least part of the way. Only just managing to keep her anger in check, she said, "Do whatever you want with it, but I don't want to see it or hear about it for the rest of my life. It has brought me nothing but misery." Mother held the violin by its neck, wishing no doubt that it was Joan's throat she could put a hand around and throttle. "Well," she said, also making an effort to remain controlled, "I'm going to leave it here while you consider your other options. You'll have to do something, you know. Now, make yourself useful while I get supper." Starting in the sitting room, Joan made her way around the house, pulling the blackouts closed. Then she opened the lid of the gramophone and chose a recording without strings. Mother was right. Joan knew she would have to find something to do, and she would have to find it quickly before Mother wore down her resolve. She watched her hands as she slid the record from its sleeve. She used them gingerly, out of habit, careful not to scrape or chafe them. She unravelled the bandage and looked at her scar. It was healing nicely, but Joan was fascinated by it as the only blemish on the soft, pampered skin. She wondered what it would be like to be a fishmonger's wife, or dig weeds, or throw coal on the fire with bare hands. She remembered a conversation she'd overheard at the hall. One of the girl's aunties or cousin, or maybe it was a sister-in-law, had been rejected from the WAFs and signed on instead to do construction work. Joan clenched and unclenched her fists and studied the sinews and veins that appeared. Then she laughed out loud for the first time in weeks as she imagined Mother's revulsion when she held out her hands, made thick and calloused from the building site, to be massaged. Mother would have to believe then that she meant what she said. As soon as Joan felt able to walk any distance, she donned her mac, rain boots and scarf and left Mother bleating after her from the door. She'd never been well covered, but now the half-stone or so she'd lost seemed to allow the cold to whirl around her hollows and rattle her bones. Shivering, she waited for the bus into town, but when it arrived, late and crowded, she decided to walk. With each stride she felt some of her strength and stamina return. This, she thought, will stand me in good stead.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
In the few months she had been incapacitated, the bombing had been relentless. Now there was not one road on the way into central London with all of its buildings standing. The closer she marched to the hub of things, the more ruinous the city became. A woman in a green jumper was selling cigarettes and papers from a hole in a boarded corner shop. A young girl stood staring at the shell of a house, her hand on the untouched gate. The centre of a block of flats had fallen in on itself, like sand running through an egg timer. She pulled her coat tight, but knew that the chills she felt were not caused by the weather alone. The initial plan she harboured was to stop at any construction site she came upon and ask for a job, but each time she approached a likely-looking situation, her courage dissolved. Some sites were small and manned by one or two older men, who Joan didn't trust not to laugh at her. Many were boarded and fenced, and had no semblance of activity she could see or hear. On the corner of Regent Street and Oxford Circus, what looked like a shop and part of a hotel were being worked on by a group of men in navy blue overalls. Joan stood under the shelter of an overhang opposite the site and watched the comings and goings. Her newfound energy and the orchestrated movements of the workers made her smile. She could imagine herself doing what they were doing. A woman of about her age in a smart check skirt and carrying a notepad came out of an office that looked like a caravan and talked to a couple of men, pointing towards parts of the bomb site with her pencil. Joan took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and ran across the road. "I say," Joan called. "Excuse me? Have you a minute?" The young woman turned. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Joan said. "Are you hiring?" The woman twirled the pencil round in her mouth and looked Joan up and down. "Who are you inquiring for?" she asked. "Your brother? Dad? A friend?" The men had stopped work and were staring at her from behind half-built walls and the rungs of ladders. The image of her being happy here, working and humming and joking amongst these people, disappeared as completely as the burnt-out building they were working on. Now she was aware of how they would pry and judge and watch and snigger. But she looked the young woman in the eye and said, "For me, actually." There was a cough behind her, then another and another. "Well," the woman said, glancing at her colleagues over Joan's shoulder. "There are women working on big building sites, but not this one, love. This is a private site. You'll need to sign on and they'll direct you from there." "Sign on," Joan said. "At the Labour Exchange." Joan wanted to ask for more information, but the woman turned to resume her discussion with the men and Joan was dismissed. When she turned the corner towards Tottenham Court Road, she stamped her feet with frustration and cold, but the thought of returning to Mother without definite news of a job spurred her on. She walked and walked. Piccadilly, Trafalgar Square, Pall Mall, Somerset House, the river. Then she saw an enormous site hidden by wooden screens and sails of tarpaulin. Women were going in and out. This is it, she thought. The project her fellow musician must have been talking about. Her stomach flipped. Here she could get on with it and prove her intentions to Mother once and for all. And so many women were crawling all over the works that she would go unnoticed. No interrogations here. She joined the queue at the inquiries window behind a woman in a rather shabby navy coat and darned stockings. Joan recoiled when she caught sight of the woman's bitten, inflamed nails. "Any work going?" the woman asked. "Got plenty, my dear," the man on duty said. "But sign on at the exchange first and tell them you want the bridge." The woman nodded. When she turned, she looked right through dusty spectacles to somewhere in the distance beyond Joan. But she seemed to know what the man was talking about, so Joan followed her. To sign on, she supposed. Chapter 4. April to July, 1941. Evelyn. It was a bright Good Friday morning. The wind was strong and gusty, shepherding clouds together, then scattering them into billowing clusters. Up here on the timber, the cold had a knack of finding the smallest of gaps, a button left undone, or a breach between scarf and collar. Tugging off a gauntlet, Evelyn rubbed under her armpit at the place where her coarse vest scratched and worried, wondering if she'd ever be able to leave it off, even in the summer. She pulled her shield aside, pushed the blackened goggles high on her forehead, and looked up at the struggling sun through a criss-crossed maze of cranes, buckets swaying gracefully on what looked like well-mannered crooked fingers on the end of lace-gloved arms. She felt giddy and grasped the side of the workbench. As usual, it would take her a minute or two to get the vastness into perspective after concentrating on her close-up welding job for so long. The shot tower rose above the gaffer's hut on the gantry, and, never mind the cold, she would much rather be here in the open than stuck inside that narrow, tapering building, turning out lead pellets for hunting. St. Paul's pierced the clouds. At its base, and pockmarking both sides of the river, were pitted black bomb sites. In the distance, V-shapes streamed out behind ships and emergency craft patrolling the choppy river. Leaning back against a load of timber, Evelyn surveyed the activity around her. Gangs of 3 or 4, bending close to their flames, were dotted along what would eventually be a road crossing. Some sort of machinery sighed and wheezed when it performed its task. Concrete churned along the pumping pipes. Lengths of steel reinforcement were lifted and moved. She had no idea what she was doing, how it all fitted together. She'd never even thought about how bridges held their loads or kept their shape, and now that she had, she was no wiser. None of the other girls did either. They simply worked on their little bit, whatever that might be, and at the end of each shift, there was more to the bridge than there had been when they started. "Evelyn!" Her name caught on the wind and trailed off towards Somerset House. The gaffer. Stooping over her work, she covered her face with her shield and lit the flame. A prod on her shoulder. Now she was for it. She turned in time to see Jim catch the stray strand of hair that he combed over his bald spot as it was whipped upwards on a particularly strong gust. He held it down with one hand and slapped his cap on with the other. "Morning, Gaffer."
"It's Mr. Adams, or Jim will do."
Jim was all right. He was the shift manager, least likely to have a go at you for stretching, or take 5 minutes off your ciggy break for resting your eyes. He had a wife and 3 daughters of his own, and the same bemused look came over his face when he talked about them as it did when he dealt with the women on the bridge. He motioned for her to step aside.
"I wonder if you'd do me a favour. I'm expecting a visitor soon."
"Who?" Evelyn saw herself curtsying in her dirty blue overalls to the Queen, who was always out and about. Or maybe it was Churchill. "Winnie?"
"Steady," Jim said,
clearing his throat and taking a pencil from his top pocket.
"A photographer from the Daily Herald."
He checked the timetable on his clipboard.
"He's due in about half an hour and wants to take a couple of pictures up here."
"Oh." Not so exciting after all.
"I thought he might snap you at work. Would that be okay?"
Evelyn pulled her shoulders back and brushed crumbs of dried concrete from her bib and braces. "Of course," she said.
"Right. I'll have a word with Gwen next."
He pointed his pencil towards Evelyn's partner, her head dangerously close to the sparks spitting from the end of the welding arm clamped in her fist. Gwen never looked up unless it was for a break or dinner. Evelyn had willed her partner to give her the slightest suggestion of wanting a chat, or of acknowledging her at the very least. But no, nothing. They'd worked side by side on this section for 4 weeks, moving their equipment along in a wheelbarrow as their stripe of steel lengthened. But Gwen hadn't exchanged as much as 2 sentences with her the whole time. It wasn't as if Evelyn hadn't tried. She talked about the dance hall she visited. She told her about being engaged to Ron and how she'd been glad when he called it off. What Dad had told her and Sylvie about how the old bridge had buckled. There was something so tired about the woman, though. Dragged down, dogged and miserable. The skin around her mouth and eyes was flaking and dry, and her fingers, when she took her gloves off, were gnawed, raw and oozing pus. Evelyn had to look away from them. Her hair was greying from the roots to a straight line above her ears, so she must have looked after herself up until a few months ago. Evelyn wondered what had happened to her at that point, and told her about Mum dying and other ghastly things, like the man around the corner who'd lost a leg, and Sylvie's friend who didn't turn up as arranged one evening. When Sylvie took the tube to where Helen had lived, the house and everyone in it was gone. Evelyn wanted Gwen to know that whatever she'd been through, she wasn't the only one. During an afternoon break, Evelyn had trailed after Gwen to a cubbyhole and hunkered down beside her. She'd held out her pack of players and said, "Siggy?" Gwen turned and stared at her with that faraway, icy look in her eyes. Perhaps she'd used the wrong word. "Fag? Go ahead." Gwen looked away and took a packet of papers and a tin, which she tapped from her pocket. Lighting her own, Evelyn smoked in the silence. "Shall I fetch us both a cuppa?" Gwen shrugged. "You go on. I'll help myself in a bit." Evelyn wasn't about to give up. They did have to work together after all. Worse luck. She flicked a measure of ash into the wind and made an effort to brighten her voice. "Well, I've told you all about my family. Dad and Mum. You know Sylvie anyway." She laughed. "Everyone knows Sylvie. How about yours?" Gwen stopped still, a pinch of tobacco between her fingers. I have a husband." "Ooh, what's his name?" "George." "Has he been called up?" Gwen shook her head. "He's reserved. On the trains." "That's lucky. At least he comes home every night. Any kids?" With a start, Gwen dropped the brown shards onto her thigh, then tried to brush them into a mound to pick up again. 3, she said softly. Evelyn felt pleased with herself. Everyone she knew with children loved to talk about them. "Girls? Boys?" 2 boys and a girl. Gwen prized the lid off the tin and stuffed the tobacco back inside. Her fingers were trembling. "Changed my mind," she mumbled and pushed past Evelyn. Tea. Hey, Evelyn called after her. What are their names, Gwen? But Gwen didn't turn, and Evelyn kept her chattering off the subject of kids after that. Problem was, it was getting harder every day to think of what to talk about when there was no response. What did she say? Evelyn asked Jim, now making his way back across the boards.
She agreed,
he said, looking over his shoulder at Gwen.
But she won't take her shield off.
I will, Evelyn said. Dad'll get some surprise when he opens his paper tomorrow. Will it be in tomorrow?
Not sure, Jim said. We'll ask the photographer.
Can Sylvie be in it too?
Oh, I don't think there's any need.
Please, she won't hide behind a shield. She'll do whatever the shutterbug wants. Besides, you know she's got a lovely smile. Jim had remarked on Sylvie's smile a number of times. Everyone had.
Go on then.
Evelyn dodged her way around hammers and jacks, slabs of stone, steel rods and timber, to where Sylvie was vibrating the concrete. She signalled with arms above her head, and Sylvie held up a finger. 1 minute. The skip expelled the last of its load, which Sylvie worked on to the last foot. Then she laid the vibrating machine aside. I've just had a break, she said, but I might be able to nip off again if I'm careful. Evelyn tugged at her sister's hand. It's not a break, she said. Take your turban off and come with me. Grab your face shield. Where are we going? To surprise Dad. What? Evelyn explained as she pulled Sylvie along. We might get discovered yet, Sylvie said, as they stopped behind a line of hopper cars to touch up their lipstick from the tube she kept in her bib pocket.
Carry on as normal, the photographer said.
Gwen did as she was told, hunching over her flame. It hadn't even seemed to register with her that anything out of the ordinary was going on. Evelyn removed her shield every time the photographer snapped, and Sylvie didn't even manage that pretence, looking straight at the camera and grinning.
No, ladies, please.
The photographer shuffled from foot to foot.
Just get on with what you usually do.
So Evelyn kept her face covered but stood tall, and Sylvie held her mask in her hand, inspecting the next reinforcement rod in line.
That's a good one. Should be in Tuesday morning.
But it wasn't. All that appeared was a short article about the bridge that Dad read aloud.
Construction of new Waterloo Bridge. The new crossing at Waterloo Bridge is pressing forward despite the inevitable setback caused by the labour shortage. The men on the bridge are working long hours and are willing to turn their hand to any task that needs to be undertaken in order to complete this vital link between North and South. In addition, the men are taking advantage of green labour to perform unskilled roles. This allows them to utilise their expertise, which is critical to complete what the government terms this building work of strategic importance.
Is that it? Sylvie peered over Dad's shoulder.
That's it. No snap of my girls.
Turn over, Dad. There might be something on the back, Evelyn said.
No, nothing there.
Well, I'll be blowed. We'll never get in the films now.
Perhaps they're saving it for another day, when everyone could do with a cheer-up. Oh, Dad chuckled. Here's something that should interest you. He spread the pages on the table and pointed to a headline. Clothes rationing begins on the 1st of June.
How could they? Sylvie snatched the paper. Let's have a look, Evelyn said. Sylvie sat on the arm of the chair so Evelyn could read the article with her. Oh, it's not so bad, Evelyn said. Not so bad? Maybe you could manage, but I have appearances to keep up. Look, a jacket, one jacket, will cost 12 of your 60 coupons. We only need our ovals during the day, so we can spend everything on our going-out clothes. Besides, everyone's in the same boat. I suppose so, said Sylvie. By the way, what's green? Green labour.
You, Dad said.
Me and Evelyn?
All you girls. Never done anything like this before, have you? It'll be a miracle if it stands half as long as the old bridge.
Evelyn cuffed Dad around his head with the paper. Right, you can get your own tea tonight.
Not likely, he said. Out of my chair, you two, and in the kitchen.
Whatever she was called, green or otherwise, Evelyn was pleased that she didn't have to queue with the hundreds of women who'd left it to the last minute to register for war work with the Employment Exchange. She supposed they would be asked what kind of work they preferred, but it might not be easy to place them where they wanted to be. She hadn't thought she'd stick this for long. It was only meant to be a stopgap until she found something in an office or teaching in one of the services. If she did want to change, now might be a good time. But she didn't want to. She loved it. The work was doing wonders for her figure, especially her arms. There was plenty of fun in the dinner break, and although you had to do the same tasks over and over again, it wasn't anything like the soul-destroying monotony of housework. It felt good to see the evidence of what you'd accomplished and the progress that was being made. Wages in your hand on a Thursday afternoon was a good feeling too. She was pleased to be able to give a few bob to Dad and have a bit left over for herself. But some of the women complained they took home much less than the men, and Evelyn did wonder a bit about that too, from time to time. Sylvie rubbed her eyes and yawned, pushing her plate of savoury mince aside. "Don't you want that?" Evelyn asked. Sylvie shook her head. "You have it. You should stay in once in a while, keep Dad company. Wouldn't have made any difference this weekend. No one managed any shut-eye. You look awful. Take a look in the mirror yourself." There was a guffaw, followed by the banging of cutlery from the tables at the back of the canteen. A tall, wiry woman, with the curled ends of her hair escaping from her flowery headscarf, called out to them. "Sylvie! Evelyn! Over here! Sit with us!" "She's such a laugh, Olive. Shall we join them?" Evelyn nodded. "I'll get my afters and see you in a minute." Olive was in full swing when Evelyn squeezed in on the end of the bench, next to a well-built young woman with high cheekbones and a ruddy complexion. Empty plates, smeared with congealing gravy or custard, were all around them, the smell of tepid fat less appetising now their stomachs were full. "I said to him," Olive went on, "I said, I'll be glad when you're sent to wherever it is you're going. I could do with a bleeding rest." "Oh, come on," he says. "This might be me last time." So I says, "You've been saying that for the past fortnight." And he comes back with, "You can't say no to a dying wish." "Oh, can't I, you dirty bugger?" I says. "So did you?" Sylvie asked, her chin on her hands. "That's a bit too close to the bone," Olive said, crossing her legs and pursing her mouth. "Let's just say I'll be leaving me push bike in the shed for a while." The table full of women burst into laughter again. More knives and forks and plates were pounded on the table. Evelyn joined in with her bowl, but could feel the heat reaching her ears. She turned away before anyone could see and pointed out to the others. The high colour on the cheeks of the girl next to her, who couldn't have been more than 19, spread over her entire face and seemed to be throbbing. Evelyn was mortified for her when she saw Olive glance over and grin and comment about to take aim. "Oh, look!" Someone facing the door whispered. "Isn't that your partner, Evelyn? What's her name? Gwen?" Evelyn nodded. Through a hand on her brow, she watched Gwen take what must have been the desecrated remains of the mince, veg, spotted dick and custard and slip into the place closest to the door, her back to their crowded table. "How do you stand it?" asked the woman next to Olive. "She never speaks. I tried a couple of times with her, but all I got for my trouble was a shrug." "And her hands," someone at the other end said with a shudder. Evelyn felt a knot in her stomach. She didn't like the way this conversation was going and tried to think of how she could bring it back to Olive and her husband's late-night larks. She'd thought the same things herself about Gwen many times, but now she felt a loyalty towards her. "Oh, she's not that bad," she said defensively. "She's a workhorse." But no one seemed to hear, and if they did, they chose to ignore her. "I don't know how she manages to hold anything. It's a wonder she hasn't had a nasty accident," the woman opposite Sylvie said, leaning in and lowering her voice. "Oh, I hope not." Olive beat on her chest with an open palm and closed her eyes. "She's already had something horrible to put up with, so I hear." "Haven't we all?" someone sniffed. Now Evelyn tilted her head forward, eager to hear the story.
What happened? Her boy ran off one night end of last year. Bad night it was. Got caught in one of Hitler's packets and that was that. His dad found him. Well, so I've been told.
Evelyn thought about the kid she could have had with Ron and the one she hoped to have with someone else. She thought about Rosie Harrison and all the other children who'd been in her class.
That's so sad, she said. What about the others?
2 of them left. Boy and girl, I think. Been sent to Wales now.
2?
Evelyn was sure Gwen had said she had 3 children.
I thought... She told me.
Every face was turned towards her, waiting for another tidbit. She shook her head.
Never mind.
Still, Olive's friend said, nodding towards Gwen's back. We could all be like that, couldn't we? No help to herself or anyone else. That seemed to be the murmuring consensus, as chairs were scraped back and cigarettes appeared from pockets. Evelyn took out her pack of 3 and offered one to the girl next to her, whose face had settled back down to its natural pink flush. As much as she tried, she couldn't stop herself looking towards Gwen, whose shoulders were huddled over what must by now be a stone-cold dinner. Picking up an ashtray, Evelyn walked across to Gwen's table and sat down opposite her. Evidence of Gwen's good manners, her knife and fork lay together on top of the plate from which only a couple of mouthfuls had been eaten. The bowl of afters Gwen was staring at was untouched, the nosepads of her spectacles green, where Evelyn thought salty tears had settled for months on end, her cheeks rough and dry. But now there was no weeping. Perhaps she was all cried out and left with that blank, faraway expression that Evelyn had come to expect on her partner's face. She wanted to say something, but couldn't think of the right words, and besides, they wouldn't have made it past the lump in her throat. She went to put her hand over Gwen's, but hesitated, and they both jerked away at the same time. Gwen looked up then, her mouth tight and her eyes narrow, daring Evelyn to come closer. Evelyn cleared her throat.
Come and sit with us, she said.
Gwen looked at her as though she was simple, took off her glasses, wiped hard at her face. Then she left without saying a word.
There's nothing you can do, Sylvie said,
making room next to her.
Don't be bothered.
But Evelyn was. 3 weeks later, nothing mattered except they'd somehow lived through the weekend. Dad was a wreck, and for him to be alarmed meant things were bad. For the first time, he forbade Evelyn and Sylvie to go out. They didn't protest, but followed him down to the tube where they dozed on and off in a sitting position, squashed into a space that seemed about the size of a packet of rationed tea. When they emerged into the smoky haze the following morning, they stood still for a minute, taking in the devastation. There was nothing new. They'd seen it, heard it, smelled it all before. But there was simply much more of it this time. More bulging roads and burst water pipes, a shoe with a torn foot laced into it, row after row of crushed houses and flats, with their sides ripped off, the intimate settings of everyday life laid open to scrutiny. The smell of burning more intense, the moan of sirens unwavering. They hurried along, watching every step.
We'll make sure everything's okay at home, then see what we can do, Dad said.
His mouth sounded dry. A warden was walking up and down Maze Road, jotting notes in his book, even though much of the terrace stood solid and upright, proud of making it through the night.
This one yours?
He pointed to their front door.
That's the one,
Dad said.
Everything all right? You're lucky. Very lucky. They took it at both ends, but the middle's intact.
He shook his head.
Funny how it goes. Could have easily been the other way around.
Dad closed his eyes, then forced himself to look at the blackened houses to the left and the right. Evelyn stepped back to take in the whole road at once, and Sylvie joined her, clutching at her arm.
Number 14, look! Just the walls hanging there. Who'd have thought they had such poor taste in wallpaper? Sometimes you go too far, Sylvie. That's not funny.
Sylvie's voice was hoarse.
It wasn't meant to be, she said.
There was no gas, no water. They gathered together a few biscuits, a torch and bandages and went along the road where they'd lived all their lives to see which neighbours needed help. The House of Commons had taken it along with Westminster Abbey, the soap factory, Victoria Station and Big Ben.
Dear old chap,
Dad said.
Still chiming, though. It'll take more than a few bombs to stop him."
Then 2 nights of eerie silence during which the warning sounded a number of times, followed immediately by the all clear. Despite that, Dad was adamant they stick to their routine of bedding down in the underground, waiting for another night like Friday, and dreading what they would find when they climbed out of their hole in the ground. But each morning what lay before them was almost unchanged from the night before. Sylvie hoped that was that. Perhaps it was finished and done. "Or maybe," Evelyn said, "we'll just have time to clear this lot up and it will start all over again." By Monday morning they were exhausted. The number 29 took so many detours they didn't recognise where they were most of the time, and the streets that should have been familiar were crumpled and distorted. From Oxford Street they caught the tube to Waterloo, and converged with the swarms of women and a handful of men making their way towards the bridge. Shuffling down to single file past the guards, every head in front of Evelyn turned to stare at a hole in the underside of the temporary bridge, twisted steel and girders hanging from it like entrails from a gaping belly. She took her turn to gulp. "That'll put us back," Sylvie said. "Wonder if the new one's been hit." "We might have to start all over again," someone said. But Evelyn didn't think so. Their work was here, above and around them. There might be a minor setback, but that was all. Quickly changing into dungarees and boots, the women shook out an array of coloured scarves and tied them into knots on their heads. One of the ladies, in a blue overall, stuck her head through the door and told them to hurry. "Jim's called a meeting," she said, "and it sounds important." Evelyn followed Sylvie to the top, turning her collar up against the fresh breeze. A smouldering residue lingered in the air, but after 2 nights without bombing they could clearly smell the tang of the Thames wafting around them. Fumes, mud, silt. It was lovely to smell the river again. For some reason the men stood on the right, the ladies on the left. How silly, Evelyn thought, but every meeting was the same. There'd been some ruckus from the men at the beginning about their jobs, but none of the women could do the skilled work anyway. Fetching and carrying, a bit of welding, that was about it. Some of the senior ladies had a bit of responsibility, but they were few and far between. All the women who took a man's job had to sign a piece of paper saying they'd step aside when the men returned, so there was no need for them to worry. Daft buggers. Evelyn scanned the crowd and nodded to 2 or 3 women behind her. Right at the back and standing away from everyone else was Gwen, her gloves under her arm, the tips of her fingers in her mouth. Evelyn caught her eye and waved, but Gwen turned away. "OK, be like that yet again," she thought. Despite the rebuff, Evelyn decided to have another go. She excused herself through the crude lines being formed and took up the empty space next to Gwen. Evelyn nodded at her partner. "How did you manage the weekend?" she said. Gwen put her hands behind her back and studied Evelyn for what felt like a long time. Her eyes in their red sockets lost their glare and softened a bit. "Part of our place took it," she said. "Worse luck? Everyone all right?" Gwen looked down at her boots and nodded. "What will you do?" "It's nothing George can't fix. We'll stay with a neighbour till then." Jim blew a whistle to get their attention. The men opposite made a point of facing forward, arms folded and lips shut tight. Jim had to blow again in the women's direction, after which the laughter and talking died down. Gwen mumbled what sounded like tar. "Sorry?" Evelyn leaned closer to Gwen's face. "Tar. Thanks for asking." Evelyn held a wide smile until she got the shadow of one back from Gwen. Holding a loudhailer and fiddling with his necktie, Jim said, "As I'm sure you're all aware, the temporary bridge took a hit on Friday night. A bus was caught up in it too, but that's now been cleared." "My nephew's wife was on that bus," a tiny woman said, "on her way home from town." "The damage has been inspected, and I've been instructed to tell you about redeployment." He took in the workforce standing in front of him. "Unfortunately, most of you will now have to be diverted to implement running repairs on the temporary bridge so that it can be reopened as quickly as possible. I've consulted with the foreman, and together we've decided who will be assigned where. For now, carry on with your duties here, and I'll make the rounds during the day to tell you who's going to work where, as from tomorrow." "I hope we're able to stick together," Gwen said. Evelyn started. Coming from Gwen, that degree of sentiment was unnerving, But perhaps there'd been a breakthrough. "We'll make sure we do," she said, certain that no one else would be tripping over themselves to work with Gwen. Evelyn felt her partner inch imperceptibly closer. A cloud scuttled, leaving their stark, inky shadows melded together across the concrete deck. Dad was reluctant to let them loose again, although he did concede that they couldn't stay cooped up with him every evening. The radio and papers told him that the Germans were concentrating their efforts elsewhere, the Atlantic and Soviet Union. "We saw those Jerrys off," he said. "They'll never get London." But still, he was wary. The Bismarck sank the Hood. The Navy sank the Bismarck. Dad and Uncle Bert went to the pub to celebrate. Evelyn and Sylvie to the West End. The Strand was buzzing, and they were glad to be back, roaming from pub to club, and finally settling on the Palace, elegant and airy, with a seamless polished dance floor, throbbing to the resident band's rendition of Judy Garland's "You Made Me Love You." They stood near the curve of the bar, the brass footrail reflecting the light from the chandelier as flickering flakes hewn from precious stones. Evelyn looked at her naked ring finger, flanked on the right by a lovely marquisette cocktail ring, which she thought much more attractive than her engagement ring had ever been. Two burly hands, wires of black hair sprouting along their backs and into khaki cuffs, rested on Sylvie's shoulders. "Hey," a voice said, drawling and languorous. He twisted Sylvie around and looked into her face. "Remember me?" Sylvie examined the man, his hands rubbing her shoulders gently. So did Evelyn. He filled out his tan uniform nicely, his broad shoulders and arms pushing against the sleeves adorned with 3 insignias. A black flash embroidered with Sask.li, brackets MG, Canada, in yellow. A red patch, a single striped chevron. His eyes were a pale hazel, striking against his weather-beaten complexion and thick russet hair. Creases appeared around his eyes when he frowned, and there were 2 deep lines framing his grinning mouth, which wore a smile wide enough to challenge Sylvie's. "No," Sylvie said, widening her eyes. "I don't think I do." "Oh, come on." He gave her a little shake. "Sure you do. It's Alec. We danced together a while back." Evelyn giggled and turned away. That wasn't narrowing it down much. "Well, hey, never mind," he said congenially, as if he really didn't. "Can I get you ladies a drink?" "Gin and dip, please," Sylvie said. "Evelyn?" "The same for me, thanks." "Consider it done. If you take this," Alex said, producing a folded khaki cap from his pocket and handing it to Sylvie, "and go and sit at that table over there with my buddies. I'll bring you your drinks." Evelyn hardly needed the seat she took possession of, twirling and whirling through the evening with anyone who asked. She didn't pay much attention to Sylvie until later in the evening, when she noticed that every time she passed her sister on the dance floor she was with Alec. She'd never known Sylvie to stick with the same fellow for an entire evening. Alec's fingers were splayed territorially across the hollow of Sylvie's back, and she played with the place where his starched collar met his neck. Their movements were fluid and relaxed. They looked good together. From then on, Alec turned up wherever they went. Evelyn was reminded of that passage from A Christmas Carol that she read to her class before they broke up at the end of the year. Wherever she went, there went he. But Sylvie was having none of it. "Oh, him," she said, when Evelyn asked how keen she was on Alec. "He's a bit of a laugh, that's all, with his hi guys and you're welcome chat." One warm, clammy Sunday in July, Evelyn took the bus to Holloway to have tea with a friend. As the bus slowed to a stop at the gates to Finsbury Park, Evelyn wiped the window and peered out at the hopeful families, picnics, flasks, bikes and umbrellas in tow, making their way across the swathes of wet grass. She was drawn to a couple sitting on the other side of the iron fence on a tartan blanket. The woman was wearing a dusty pink jacket, very like one of Sylvie's most prized garments. Evelyn wiped at a fresh layer of mist that had appeared where her breath hit the window. The jacket not only looked like Sylvie's, it was Sylvie's, and the man with his arm wrapped around its shoulders was Alec. Evelyn banged on the window to wave. The conductor rang the bell and the bus lurched forward. Alec glanced around, as if aware that someone was trying to get their attention, but Sylvie, her head leaning on his expansive chest, looked as though she didn't have a clue what was going on around her, except that she was with him. Slumping against the back of the seat, Evelyn felt stunned. Not that Sylvia had met someone who made her gaze at him in that spellbound way, but that it had happened so fast. She looked out at the streets she barely recognised on the once familiar route, and wondered at how quickly things could change, in the flare of a bomb or the flash of a smile. Chapter 5. August to November 1941. Gwen. George would be furious with her if he knew, having forbidden her from entering the house until it was finished and he'd given the OK. But she needed to dare herself to step over the threshold and test whether the hush of missing children still screeched at her, or if she could feel at peace in the comfort of personal objects and smells and noises in her own home. George was on the late shift, so was spending the day diligently shoring up the hole in the kitchen. She couldn't see him from the front of the house, but she could hear the rhythmic scrape of his shovel on concrete. It was like a subdued version of the sounds on the bridge, the harsh clash of hard materials coming together to create something solid and substantial, ready to be knocked down in an instant. She found her key and turned the chilly piece of metal over in her hand a couple of times, wincing when it caught on a shredded cuticle. Then, with one more glance towards the steady din in the garden, Gwen slipped into the narrow hallway, the echo of her sigh whispering around her. A coat had fallen from the line of pegs and lay crumpled on the floorboards. They'd talked about repapering the green flowery walls, but that had been months ago. It hardly mattered now. She walked around the sitting room, picking up their wedding photo, fondling the porcelain bell George had surprised her with on her birthday, smoothing the chair backs over the places where their heads rubbed dark shiny spots onto the fabric. She brushed a few stray cinders into the grate, then sat and closed her eyes, willing some warmth from the past to penetrate the chill. Even though it was cool for August, she could smell from where she sat the layer of drying mud that George had loosened, releasing with it the earthy scent of turned-over vegetable plots and late summer picnics. She remembered Mudchute Park 2 years ago, when the war was a rumbling undercurrent, unimaginable as they looked out at the heat haze shimmering over their little corner of Cubitt town, rows of houses and factories safe and intact. Johnny had come racing across the grass, threatening them with his dirt-encrusted palms. Will not far behind. He'd knocked a toddling Ruth off her feet and made straight for Gwen. Screaming with terror, she'd shouted, "Help me, Dad! Save me from the big bad mucky monster!" George had jumped to his feet and grabbed Johnny under his arms, swinging him round and round until they dropped to the ground, exhausted with laughter. Had it really been that easy to be so happy? She hadn't understood it then. Simple satisfaction, good fortune, contentment. It was only when she looked back that she knew she'd experienced those things. How sad to only know happiness in retrospect. She shivered and wondered if George would be so intent on his task that she could get away with going into the kitchen. She thought better of that idea, but her eyes were drawn back to the wall separating the hallway from the stairs. She crossed the passage quickly, hoping George wouldn't choose that minute to stretch and look about. She manoeuvred around the floorboards she knew would creak and groan beneath the red strip of worn carpet. Powdery grime covered the landing, swirling in a vortex as she unsettled it with her movements, taking in the mess. An abandoned slipper, a hairbrush on its side where she'd thrown it the night they took the packet. She'd have her work cut out when they could move back in. There was a clatter beneath her, followed by, "Bugger! Bloody thing!" Before she could change her mind, she turned right and shoved open the kids' bedroom door. The curtain dividing Ruth's side of the room from the boys' side was pulled back, so all 3 beds were in full view. She remembered washing and ironing Will and Ruth's bedclothes, smoothing them into place and tucking them around the mattresses so they were fresh and crisp, ready for when they came home. But she had no recollection of straightening Johnny's covers or shaking his pillows. Betty had wanted to strip the bed and get rid of it, go through all his things and give them to the WVS for children who'd been bombed out. But Gwen had said she wasn't ready. So Betty must have come up here during a quiet moment and tidied Johnny's bed. She couldn't imagine George would have done such a thing. Putting her spectacles in her pocket and throwing her coat on the little chair that all the kids had sat in as toddlers, she lay face down on Ruth's bed and breathed in. There was the smell of the copper and boiled linen, a good drying day, a trace of smoke from where the sheets had been finished off around the fire. Will's was the same. She hesitated next to Johnny's bed, then threw herself down, clamping his pillow to her face and inhaling until her lungs felt distended. She breathed in and choked and sobbed. Thank goodness Betty hadn't gone ahead in a frenzy, washing away all that was left of her boy. She still had the smell of him. Rolling over, she grabbed his dressing gown, hanging from a hook. She smothered her face in it, taking in the sweet, boyish smell mingled with the first suggestion of saltier grown-up sweat. Carrying it with her, she found his Christmas book and stroked the pages, feeling for the imprint of his fingers. She brushed a clump of dried mud off his worn football, retrieved countless times from Betty's garden. How she'd nagged him about that, and his spellings, and taking his shoes off without untying the knots. She couldn't believe she'd ever been so stupid, so petty. There was a sudden unnerving quiet from below. Then Betty's voice carried up to her. "Is she not home yet?" "I haven't seen her," George answered. "Perhaps she's doing a spot of overtime." A grunt from George. Gwen imagined him shrugging and looking impatiently at his repair job, waiting to get on. "Why don't you take her to the pub tonight?" Betty said. "Or the pictures? It'd be—" Her voice trailed off, as if she'd turned the other way. George must have moved to face her, because although she strained, Gwen couldn't hear his reply. George took Len to the pub that evening instead, allowing the older man to lean on his arm for support, while she sat in with Betty. Gwen cut through the steel rod on first one edge, then the other. Evelyn caught the discarded ends and threw them into the waste. Each time a length was finished, Evelyn signalled to a banksman who would signal in turn to a crane driver who swung the load out over the river, then across to where it would be used to bring on the south side of the bridge. She and Evelyn were supposed to swap places every hour, but they rarely bothered, both of them more content with things this way around. Gwen could keep her goggles and shield over her face and concentrate on the small space in front of her, the cutting flame, the length of steel. Evelyn could chat away to her, and she wouldn't be expected to acknowledge or answer. The men preferred Evelyn's quips to her silence too. Mind you, Evelyn wasn't half the flirt her sister was, although Sylvie herself had calmed down a bit lately. Gwen was glad the gaffer hadn't separated them when they'd been sent to help patch up the temporary bridge, and he'd kept them together when it was reopened in the middle of September and all hands were back on the tools up here. The pierce of a whistle cut through the hum of machinery. The noise ground to a stop, and Evelyn put her fingers to her lips and nodded to a crowd of women gathering next to a hut. Gwen waved Evelyn away. "You go on," she said. But Evelyn put her arm through Gwen's and almost dragged her along. Olive was holding court, singing the first verse of Roll Out the Barrel over and over again until there was no fun left in the barrel to bother about. "Who's for a quick one a bit later?" She was so loud. "I'd rather have a slow one," a pretty girl said, blowing smoke out through plump lips. "Wish I could think that fast," Evelyn said. "How about it, Gwen? Do you fancy a drink when we knock off?" "I didn't think you'd bother with the local," Gwen said. "Thought you'd be uptown dancing." "That's later. There's a crowd who go to the Hero of a Saturday afternoon for 1 or 2. Gwen thought about the look she'd get if she went home with beer on her breath. It was all right for the younger ones, and those like Olive who seemed to do whatever they wanted, but it wasn't for her. "Tar for asking, but I'll have to be getting home." A girl with very red cheeks and her partner, whose name Gwen thought was Joan, joined them. "I told her it were the Hero and not that other one." Everyone laughed, poking fun at the way the girl spoke. It was strange. Gwen had never heard anything like it. She sounded as though she must be from the country, and she looked as though she would be at home there too, milking cows or bringing in the harvest. "Say it again, Alice," Joan said, who enunciated each word perfectly, as if she'd been born in a bay window. "What were it you told me?" Alice shook her head. "No, but I'll try to say it like you does." And there was more laughter as Alice rolled the words around in her mouth and spilled them out in an upper-crust voice. Gwen pointed vaguely in the direction of the cloakroom, then scuttled through a canvas-covered doorway and down a sloping tunnel of stifling tarpaulin corridors, held back by criss-crossed planking. When she was level with the river, she made her way across a couple of wooden walkways to a place that she thought of as her own. Here, the concrete arches were complete, and she sat under a miniature scaffolding tower that looked as if it had been abandoned. The structure wobbled precariously, as if it might topple, leg by leg, rod by rod, into the dirty water that lapped beneath her, and embed itself in all the other junk discarded on the river bed. No one would miss it. She closed her eyes and felt it sway above her. A good gust of wind, and perhaps she'd go over with it. She imagined herself being pulled away from the noise and light, boots dragging her down. Perhaps her head would smash against the pier, or her sleeve become entangled in a bit of the scaffolding, and she'd thrash around, suspended there like a forgotten item of worn clothing pegged to the line, until her lungs burst. She pictured her spectacles floating away, her turban loosening, the few coppers she had spiralling down, unlucky coins in a mocking well. Sodden fags and matches in her pocket, a grab for the envelope that arrived yesterday. Voices rose to shouting pitch behind her, followed by the grinding of gears, then a lull, indistinct cursing, relieved laughter. They were pouring concrete into the arch that she and Evelyn had been working on. She shivered. It was colder than ever down here. The underside of the bridge, untouched by the weak autumn sun. She watched the water slap the pier, a green tide mark already established on the concrete. She took her locker key from her pocket and carved initials in the concrete. GG, GG, JG, WG, RG, encircling them with a chalky heart. Now all of her family was here with her. Reaching into her bib, she pulled out an envelope and took a little postcard from it, turning it over to look at the picture on the front, a puppy outlined in thick black pencil, drawn with diligence and a heavy hand. It looked like a cotton ball with scrawny legs and startled eyes, its tail pointing upwards in a wag. Two figures stood watching, a girl in a pink check dress clutching a doll who was dressed in identical clothes. She was holding hands with a long-limbed stick woman. All three had red crescent-shaped smiles on their round faces. Her first reaction had been that Ruth didn't own a pink dress, so the drawing couldn't be of her. Then she read the back. Dear Mum and Dad, this is me and Auntie Peggy with my new puppy. Uncle Bryn gave her to me for my own. In the picture, I'm in my new frock made by Auntie. I'm learning my lessons. Here are 3 kisses, one for Mum, one for Dad, and one for Betty. Kiss, kiss, kiss. From the start, Ruth's cards had been much the same. Nice things seemed to be happening to her. Lovely walks, bread-making, bedtime stories. From time to time, there was a longer letter from Peggy, telling Gwen about Ruth's life in more detail. And although she was pleased to get them, she found them difficult to read. Part of her jealous that this other woman, kind as she sounded, was enjoying what was rightfully hers. Next, the letter from Will. Although he and Ruth had been separated, their letters always arrived in the same envelope, and his were written on almost transparent paper. To save money on postage, she supposed. His hand was coming on. She could read all of it except the bits where the ink blobbed. She could picture him, gazing intently into the distance, searching for the right word, unaware of the stain his pen was making while it rested on the thin paper. Dear Mum and Dad, do you remember the road I told you about that nothing ever goes down except horses and carts? We used to play football there every day after school. But now it's dark in the afternoons, me and Marty don't have enough time after we finish our chores. Our team, the Vackies, won 5 games to 4 over the lads who live here. Vackies is what the boys round here call us, but we just give it them back, like Dad told me and Johnny. Don't start it, but make sure you give as good as you get. Me and Marty go to bed early, and sometimes we can hear Mr. and Mrs. Morgan talking and laughing downstairs with their David and Jane, but we don't mind because we have an oil lamp and our comics. Please send some more, as we have passed the last ones back and forth, and they are torn now. Can you send some stamps and another pair of socks, as I've put my toe through the ones I've with me? Sorry, I look out for Ruth at school. Tell Betty I will write to her tomorrow after my homework and chores. Will. 35 kisses. Gwen folded it over and tucked it away with the postcard. She'd felt uneasy when she'd first read it yesterday, but couldn't think why. She had no argument with getting the kids to help out. She and George had always insisted all three of them do their fair share according to their ages. No, it wasn't that, or the fact that Will and Marty were sent to their room early. She'd already gathered that Mrs. Morgan was no Auntie Peggy, and she told herself that George was right. Better off tucked up in bed early than never tucked up in bed again. And he had his pal with him for company, which must have made things seem a bit more bearable, as he and Marty had always been a pair. A right little pair, for as long as she could remember. Sitting on the same bench at school, playing conkers and football and chase, always in and out of each other's houses. But now it struck her. It was the kisses. She'd been pleased to get so many. She'd counted them and pressed her lips to the sheet of paper that many times over. Once there had been 3 for her birthday, but other than that, 2 was his limit. She didn't like it. By the end of the day, Gwen had made up her mind. She'd get herself to Llansant to visit Ruth and Will. Plenty of mothers had made the trip, some of them more than once. It was dark when Gwen arrived home. Betty's blackouts were drawn as usual, but the familiar clatter of pots and pans, the smell of boiling greens and stewing meat was missing. She turned the back doorknob and put her shoulder to the sticking wood, but it jarred against her. She tried harder, then realised it was locked. Gwen couldn't remember Betty ever locking her back door. With shaking fingers she searched for her key and turned the lock. The kitchen was cold. "Betty?" she called. "Bet!" The words echoed back to her. She closed the door and turned on a light. Propped against the brown teapot was a note addressed to her in George's writing, telling her that Betty and Len's daughter-in-law was having trouble with the baby. George was helping them to Clapham to be with her. She was a lovely girl, Annie, and their Ray was gentle and quiet, like Len, had his cheeky sense of humour too. Ray was away with his mob, and this was their first little one. When was it due? Gwen wondered. Shame washed over her for not remembering. Betty would know the expected date to the minute if it had been the other way around. She turned the note over and scribbled a message to George. She would be going to Wales that evening and be home in a few days. She didn't tell him she might have the kids in tow. Somewhere between London and Swansea, during the early hours of the morning, Gwen woke with a start. She could see the icy mist of her breath, but her palms and underarms were clammy with sweat. She'd been to Southend on the train, but never any further, and never by herself. She tucked the ends of her scarf under her collar and glanced into the little mirror above the opposite seats to check on her case in the rack, then nestled her head into the scratchy red seat cover. A woman in the corner, a large brown bag on her lap, was snoring softly through a blocked nose. She peeped around the stiff window blind, hoping that dawn would be breaking, but the sky was as inky as the blackout shade. She closed her eyes again and fell into an agitated sleep. At Swansea, she had almost 2 hours to wait for the train to Kidwelly. Finding the ladies' waiting room, she bought a cup of tea and a Welsh cake and sat looking at the rain that fell in torrents, as if someone was throwing bucketsful down from a height. She'd never complain about the drizzle in London again. She kept her eye on the station clock, worried she'd missed the train, as she couldn't understand a word the station announcer said. As soon as the 6:39 to Kidwelly flipped into view on the departure board, she hurried to the platform and heaved her case into the first empty compartment she came across. This part of the journey was an hour, and after that 2 miles or so to Llansant. A woman, with dark hair escaping from clips behind her ears, opened the compartment door and flopped down next to Gwen. "Llansant?" she asked. Gwen nodded, relieved to hear a London voice. "Thought so. You look how I feel. Well, it ain't far now. Just the 2-mile trek." "A trek? Can't we catch a bus?" The woman chuckled without changing the set of her mouth. "Is this your first visit?" "Yeah. You've been before, have you?" "Twice. And no, there's no such thing as a bus out here. I got a lift on the back of a cart first visit, but the next time I walked." Despite being soaked already, they fished out umbrellas and, cowering under them, started down a muddy lane together. Through the curtain of rain, Gwen saw rolling fields, trees, stone walls, and the odd pinprick of a cottage or barn. No sign of a town. A pungent smell rose up around them, a fresh green fragrance mixed with a more feral rotting odour. The quiet was daunting too. Gwen strained every muscle, waiting for the siren, or the screeching of a bomb, or the racket of machinery. On the outskirts of the town, they stopped. "I'm going this way," the woman said, pushing her dripping hair off her face. "Where are yours?" "My little girl's in Parky Saint," Gwen answered, having decided it would be better to surprise Auntie Peggy than Mrs. Morgan. She held out a bit of paper for the other woman to read. "Oh," she said, "Parky Sant. Mine have left the side door open for me, but if yours don't know you're coming, you'd be best to wait outside the church." She indicated a white tower that loomed over the village. "Everyone'll be in there this morning. If you fancy some company, I'm going home on Wednesday." "I'll have to be getting back myself then," Gwen said. They made plans to meet at the same place in 3 days' time. Gwen had expected the town to be as open as the countryside, with space between and around each house. Instead, the terraces were as tightly packed together as they were in London, except that they were made from rough, deep blue stone. Coils of black smoke twisted from chimney pots and disappeared into the grey sky. A cat watched her from the steps of the Joiners' Arms. There was a bakery, an ironmonger, a butcher, a little school, the churchyard of All Saints. From behind the graves came the swell of singing, rising to a thunderous crescendo. She opened the gate and sheltered under a yew tree, waiting for the service to finish. For a second, Ruth didn't know her. Her little girl stared with wide eyes, a frown on her face, then broke away from Auntie Peggy's hand and ran towards her. "Ruth," Peggy called. "Stay with me here, there's a good girl." Gwen and Ruth clung to each other, muttering each other's names over and over. "Excuse me." Peggy strode across the grass with purpose. "I don't think we know you." Gwen produced the postcard from Ruth and said, "Ruthie's mum." Auntie Peggy's hand covered her mouth, as if to stop herself from calling out. "Look at you," she said. "Why didn't you let us know you were coming to visit?" "I'm sorry." Gwen's voice quivered. "It was spur of the moment." Well, Peggy said, her hands on her narrow hips. "Shall we get Mammy home and get her dry?" Ruth's head bobbed up and down, the ribbons in her plaits bouncing. Her hair had grown, and so had she. A couple of inches taller at least. Ruth put one hand in her mother's, the other in Auntie Peggy's. "Please," Gwen said. "I don't want to be a nuisance. But Will?" "He's not here, Mum," Ruth said. "I looked for him in church." There was the slightest lilt in Ruth's voice, endearing and troubling at the same time. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Morgan." Peggy shook her head, her thin lips a taut line. "They don't attend morning service. They wait until the evening." "Perhaps I should go there now? I can't wait to see Will too." "Let me send word with Bryn, Mrs. Gregson. He'll bring Will round to ours for you. That would be the best idea." "Ta," Gwen said. "I really am so grateful to you." "Now, don't be silly. Everyone has to do war work, don't they? And I dare say ours is much more pleasant than most." She took Gwen's case. "Please, call me Gwen." "Gwen? Now there's a lovely old Welsh name." "Yeah, I suppose it is. I'd never thought before."
End of CD 3.